Good evening, soulmates. I'm Dr. Nii Quartelai Quartey.
I'm Jehmu Greene.
And I'm Richard Fowler.
And welcome to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. In just 30 minutes, the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol will continue its series of primetime hearings. With a divided America, these hearings will seek to convince the nation that former President Donald Trump's claims of a stolen election incited his followers to violently invade the Capitol and interrupt the peaceful transfer of power.
Chairing the primetime hearings and the Select Committee is Mississippi Congressman and Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Benny Thompson, who is also a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. However, and unfortunately, Representative Thompson will not be chairing tonight's hearing after testing positive for COVID-19 this week. In fact, there are a lot of people who in DC have been testing positive. We just got word that President Biden tested positive for COVID. This pandemic is still clearly with us. And we are seeing the government react in ways that is much different than a year ago, where we're able to continue to have things like this hearing. The business is able to continue moving forward in DC. And what we're hearing from the White House is they were prepared for this. And so I think the hearing leadership was also prepared for this.
I think that's right, Jehmu. I think at this point in time, if you talk to folks at the White House around Biden's positive COVID diagnosis today, they were waiting for this moment. It was a matter of time before the current president caught COVID. And we found out late last week, early this week, that Congressman Benny Thompson has caught COVID, and there's many other government officials who seem to be catching COVID. This is a new variant that has seemed to sort of snake its way through past multiple vaccinations, but we're sending our best wishes to Congressman Benny Thompson as he makes a speedy recovery. According to sources familiar with the committee's plan for tonight's hearing, they plan to call out the insurrectionists. And they also plan to call out friendly Republican lawmakers who have since downplayed the insurrection's severity by calling it tourists walking through the Capitol.
Committee sources have obtained never-before-seen outtakes from former President Donald Trump's video message to his supporters the day after the insurrection.
According to folks familiar with the plan, 2 former White House aides are expected to testify as they examine the role that former President Trump played from the ending of the Stop the Steal rally to the actual ending of the carnage that happened at the United States Capitol. 2 of those folks will be former Deputy National Security Advisor Matthew Pottinger, as well as former press aide Sarah Matthews. Both of these individuals resigned immediately on January 6th because of the lack of action from the former president of the United States, Donald J. Trump.
However, the committee has been known to switch plans last minute. Yep, they have been known to switch plans last minute. I mean, this committee has really created, can we say, must-see TV? Each hearing has been riveting in its own way because of those real people stories. We can't forget, the testimony around President Trump reaching for the steering wheel and the beast. At times, we wondered if we were, watching a hearing that was covering a real life, high stakes issue happening in our government, or were we watching sort of, the deleted scene from House of Cards? And so we'll see as this hearing prepares to begin in a little less than half an hour, just how riveting the testimony will be today. But tonight, one of the things that we plan to do is to take a deep dive into how the role of white supremacy was. We plan to take a deep dive into the role of white supremacy. And one of the things that we've talked about this, Richard and Jehmu, we talked about this during the last time we covered the primetime hearing, is that white supremacy is on trial here, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Do you still agree, Richard, that white supremacy is on trial today?
I think white supremacy has been on trial from the beginning of these hearings. The question is who is the actual jury, right? And I think that's always been the question. I think from the first time we were all here together, we saw millions of Americans tune in. From that time on, many of these January 6th committee hearings were done during the day. Many folks were at work. Many folks were on vacation. Many folks were taking care of their little ones or their big ones. And as a result, we haven't seen that many folks tune in. The question tonight will be, how many folks will tune in and how will this impact their vote in the midterm elections? And I think since the last time we've all been together, the Supreme Court has said a couple of things about a lot of things, including a woman's right to choose, including the EPA and their control over climate change. So there's a lot at stake for the American voter. And the January 6th committee is just one of those things. And I think for African-American voters in particular, the question is how much weight will this committee hearing have, or these series of hearings will have on their vote in just a couple of weeks from now?
You raise a really good point, Richard, that so much history has been made since the beginning of these hearings. So many, court decisions that have seemingly wound the clock back on our civil rights and civil liberties. I'm curious, Jehmu, I mean, you've done a lot of work over the years around voting and elections, and you've crisscrossed this country and then some. What's your sense of how tonight's hearings might animate Black voters as we head into the midterms?
Well, I think that we have, as you said, seen so much drama over these past few weeks that it is starting to have an impact on all voters, and yes, even Black voters. To your point about white supremacy, we can't forget that there are actually two audiences here. There is the court of public opinion, and I think the leadership of this committee has been doing an excellent job really speaking to, providing evidence to that court of public opinion, who in November will go and cast their ballots. And then there's the Justice Department, the only entity that can really make sure that there is accountability, real legal accountability. And I think they have also done a good job in making their case to the Justice Department. And we cannot forget how white supremacy is at the core of these hearings. There were rioters that were blatantly and proudly hurling racial slurs against the Capitol police officers. Thinking back to January 6th, we had so many images of the rioters, the insurrectionists waving the Confederate flag, that those pictures of the Confederate flag being walked through the Capitol will forever be stained into my heart. We had gallows and nooses that recalled the lynchings of Black people that appeared on and around the Capitol grounds. And so white supremacy has been baked into this from the beginning. I would like to see the committee and the conversation that takes place in these hearings really lift those issues up more. I think that it's really important, not just for Black voters, but the response in the court of public opinion, the more that we can recall and show images and make that direct line of connection that exists in reality to white supremacists and these white nationalist militias that were really driving these actions on January 6th, the greater the impact I think we'll see in November. And yes, people are up in arms with what the Supreme Court has been doing with our civil rights and our civil liberties. I've been saying since the Roe ruling came down, since Roe was gutted, that I know the polls are showing that it's going to be very hard for Democrats in November. I think people are getting it wrong. I think that they went a step too far, and then they went 2 steps too far. And now with everything in the accumulation of it, they've gone 50 steps too far. And we will see that impact in November.
Oh, at the beginning of our coverage, Richard, Jehmu had mentioned that Congressman Benny Thompson has taken ill after having tested positive for COVID. President Biden has tested positive for COVID. Between the uptick in COVID-19 cases, pocketbook issues, in addition to sort of the real, clear, and present dangers when it comes to the overturning of Roe and other decisions that have come down from the Supreme Court, does the January 6th hearing, will it still resonate? You think it will still resonate with voters as we get closer to November? Or is the January 6th hearing really competing hard for attention among the American electorate, particularly Black voters?
Listen, I'll be honest with you. I think that this committee hearing is competing for attention. And it's competing for attention with the fact that folks have to go buy gas every day, and the gas prices are too high. And that's not the only price that's too high. The rent is too high, right? And if you were somebody who were trying to buy a house, thanks to the fact that the Feds have raised interest rates, you're now priced out the market. So I think there's a lot of different things and a lot of different inputs getting folks to the midterm elections beyond just the January 6th committee. If this committee was happening in a vacuum, and this is the only thing happening, then of course, this would be prime time for what voters would think. But with so many issues, cross-cutting the intersections of American politics, the jury's going to be out on whether or not this really matters. Now, where I do agree with Jehmu is that I think for a long time, Republicans were starting to measure the curtains in the Capitol, in the Speaker's office, and in the Majority Leader's office in the Senate, because they thought they would take over both chambers. If you look at these numbers now, right, if you look at all the polling now, the generic congressional ballot has Democrats and Republicans pretty much tied, which says to me that what once was an advantage given to Republicans because of the economic restraints that we find ourselves in has been taken away by the fact that the Supreme Court has overstepped its boundaries, has been taken away by the fact that we have seen white rage turn into mass shootings all across the country, and people want to see real action from the United States Senate, the United States Congress, to stop the idea that somebody can walk in and wake up and go buy a weapon of war and kill people indiscriminately. And so there's a lot of issues that make this election, I would say at this point, way too close to call for either side. But the one thing that's not factoring into this, which is very interesting, is that these numbers are shifting for the Democrats at a time where the president's approval rating is at the lowest that we've seen a president's approval rating in decades.
It actually is lower. President Biden's approval rating is lower than former President Trump's approval rating right after
the insurrection.
And that is quite telling. But I do think there is one very significant impact these hearings have had. And we've seen that with Republicans, where there has been this, first it started off as a small shift, and now it's sort of snowballing around Governor Ron DeSantis raising his profile, the polling numbers that are coming in. Republican donors, Republican voters are starting to have said they've had enough of President Trump. It's that drip, drip, drip from the hearings, the continuing conversation coming from President Trump around the 2020 election being stolen, the big lie. And we have seen Governor DeSantis really take advantage and benefit from really Republicans just eventually, and finally growing tired of President
But here's
Trump.
the real question, Nii Quartelai and Jehmu. Who's more dangerous, Donald J. Trump or Ron DeSantis?
That is a good question, because I don't think anyone would say that Donald Trump was good at governing, and certainly Ron DeSantis has been. Before we get back to this primetime hearing, we're going to take a quick break. When we return, Cliff Albright, co-founder of Black Voters Matter, will join us.
Welcome to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. Tonight, we plan to connect the dots between the January 6th attack, the 2022 midterms, and what's at stake for Black Americans. Right now, we want to welcome co-founder of Black Voters Matter, Cliff Albright. Cliff, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, what are your thoughts so far about the hearing? We are less than 20 minutes away from the second primetime hearing. There's been a lot in the news of late, particularly around the text messages or lack of text messages being made available by Secret Service to the January 6th committee. What do you make of what's happening as we're heading into this historic primetime hearing?
Yeah, I think historic is a word that we really can't overuse enough when we're talking about these hearings. I think the first thing that we always got to keep in mind, especially us as Black folks, is that when we're talking about this insurrection and the attempts to overturn the election, we have to be really clear that what this hearing is really about is the attempts to silence and overturn Black votes, right? Keep in mind, they were trying to overturn particular states. And when you look at the states that they were saying were fraudulent elections, we know that in Georgia, they were trying to say was fraudulent, right? Donald Trump was obsessed with those Black votes in Atlanta and Fulton County. We know that they were obsessed with Black folks in Philadelphia and the Pennsylvania results. We know that they were obsessed with the Michigan results. Essentially, what they were protesting and what the insurrection was about was trying to say that these Black votes were fraudulent, and therefore these state totals were fraudulent, and that the entire election needed to be overturned. So we've got to be crystal clear about that fact. I think Jehmu did a good job of saying it. White supremacy is, at least to a certain extent, on trial when we're talking about this insurrection and talking about these hearings. But I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind, talking about the history of it, is that this is not the first attempt to violently overthrow an election. Again, as Black folks, we know this history of them trying to overthrow elections. We can go all the way back to the Reconstruction era and see that they not just tried, but actually did overthrow elections. We could go back to 1889 in Wilmington, North Carolina, where they overthrew and had a coup and got rid of local governance there. And so as Black folks, we've seen this before. And that's why I think we're very clear that what we're seeing is still a slow motion insurrection taking place. And it's something that we've got to take very seriously, because if they don't deal with this adequately, then basically what this becomes is just practice for the next successful coup attempt.
And Cliff, let me start by saying thank you for the incredible work that you and your co-founder, Latasha Brown, have done with Black Voters Matter in really communicating to Black voters, providing resources for voter registration, for Get Out the Vote. I've seen the impact that y'all have had here in Texas, pushing back against all of the incredible legislation to take away our voting rights. As Black Voters Matter prepares for mobilizing Black voters in the 2022 election, we do have all of this drama. We've got the text messages being erased. We've got the former president lunging at Secret Service and trying to grab the steering wheel. We've got more drama than my mom's stories that she still watches to this day. How is Black Voters Matter planning on weaving this drama that, as you said so rightly, is all intended to erase the votes, the choices, the intelligence of Black voters? How does that messaging play with the folks that y'all are talking to with your plans going into November? Will this be a big part of the conversation?
Yeah, I think so. To the extent that it's connected to everything else that our communities are concerned about. In other words, when you know that you've got white supremacists that were trying to overthrow an election and were willing to resort to violence in order to do so, there's a straight line that connects that to everything else that we're seeing, right? To the attacks on teaching history, right? That talks about race and not being able to talk about race in the school systems. We see that there's a connection between this insurrection and the growing authoritarianism and the attempt to control women's bodies, which will have disastrous impact, particularly on Black women, who we already know have maternal mortality rates that are 6 times higher than white women's maternal mortality rates. And so anything that restricts or criminalizes abortion, we know that from both of those perspectives, from the health perspective, but also from the criminalization perspective, that that's going to have a disastrous impact on our community. All these issues are connected. Even if you're concerned just with inflation, right? And that's your main issue, right? Which I always say isn't really inflation. It's actually just price gouging, because there's no economic reason for these prices to go up right now. It's simply price gouging and corporate greed. But even if that's your main issue, guess what? You can't expect somebody to care about your pocketbook and about your kitchen table economic issues or about your inflation when you've got some people who fundamentally don't believe that you have the right to exist, that fundamentally don't care if the police are abusing or killing you, and don't care if women are dying trying to give birth when they, even when their life is at risk. If they don't care about your fundamental rights to vote, if they don't care about our humanity, they're not going to care about the inflation that our communities are dealing with. So part of what we do when we talk to folks is that we get them to see that all of these issues are connected, and that's why it's important that we be involved in making sure that we've got not just the White House but a Congress that will actually act on the issues that we care about, and that means adding to the already even Senate that exists, because we all know that 2 of those folks on one team aren't really part of the team in terms of Manchinima.
So, Manchinima, that's a good one. Cliff, thank you for joining us. So I want to bring that into focus, the control of the United States Senate, right? And we talked about, and the Quartelai talked about, and you talked about in your former response there, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, all possible areas where there are the potential for Democrats to pick up 3 seats. There's a lot of polling that sort of shows that there's a disillusionment amongst African-American voters because they went to vote in 2020 with high aspirations and with commitments from the White House and from Democrats to get major things done that have not always been done, whether it be voting rights, whether it be police reform, etc. So what's the message that you guys are sort of bringing home to voters in a time in which a lot of African-American voters feel like they're going to the bank and they're trying to withdraw money, and the bank keeps telling them, the bank of the Democratic Party, that keeps telling them that there's insufficient funds for the fact that they voted over and over again?
Right. No, that's a great question. And part of what we have to do is we have to learn the lessons from 2 years ago, which is really a lesson that should have been learned even before 2 years ago. But we have to be very clear. And what we're doing with Black Voters Matter is we have what we call a voting rights contract, right? And really we're doing this on other issues too, but particularly with voting rights, where we're saying, look, it's not enough that we just, you hear this language, right? That, oh, Democrats just need 2 extra seats. That's not necessarily the case if you get 2 more people who are just like those other 2, Manchinima, who are going to go there and not be in support of voting rights and not be in support of modifying the filibuster or ending the filibuster, not even just for voting rights, but for all these other issues that we've been talking about where the Senate is holding things up. So what we're demanding is that candidates sign a voting rights contract up front where they commit to things like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act or the Freedom to Vote Act or modifying the filibuster or even expanding the court, which is also something that we need to have more and more conversations about, getting them to go on record now while they're campaigning, so that we don't get surprised come January after we've added 2 seats and then we find out that the 2 people that we added aren't really committed to doing the things that we thought that they were going to do. I'm actually going to say something right now that I haven't said anyplace else. Not only if the Democrats do right, and as long as the election is not stolen, which is a big if, I believe that Democrats are not just going to pick up the 2 extra seats. I believe there's a possibility to pick up 3 seats. You already mentioned Wisconsin. We know about Pennsylvania. We know about Ohio. I even believe that North Carolina, Sherry Beasley is definitely in play there. I think that there's an opportunity to gain at least 3 seats, but that's only going to happen if between now and then Democrats continue to show and do some of the things that the House is doing right now. They've passed a series of bills, which is trying to make that line very clear, the difference between this party and that party, the difference between a party that'll say that we're going to protect women and that we're going to protect contraception, or we're in 2022 talking about whether or not there's a right to have contraception, but that they're passing things that make those lines crystal clear. Those are the kinds of things that are going to be necessary so that voters understand that there's a clear difference and they've actually got some folks and some legislation that will get passed if we come out and vote.
Cliff, I'm so glad that you're here because I've been dying to ask you this question. I was just reading in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that since 2017, 45 states have considered over 200 anti-protest bills, so far enacting 38 of them, mostly in reaction to the work of Black Lives Matter and environmental protesters, among others. For the folks that are just now tuning into this, these laws significantly increase liability for common forms of peaceful protest. Are you as concerned about this as I am and as our viewers should be?
Yes, we're very concerned. In fact, there's a case that we're talking about right now where we've got a petition going for a sister named Brittany Martin, who was in South Carolina, who was leading a Black Lives Matter protest, and she got arrested, prosecuted for what would basically be like disturbing the peace. But because of this anti-protest hysteria, she's been sentenced to 4 years in jail, and she is 3 months or 4 months pregnant right now. So yes, we are very concerned about that the wave of the anti-protest bills. I know that the hearing's about to start, but folks can see our social media or our website if they want to learn more about that case or about what we can do more broadly to deal with this anti-freedom of speech movement.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go to a break and we'll be right back. You're watching Fox Soul's primetime coverage of the primetime January 6 hearings.
Welcome back to Fox Soul special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. I'm Richard Fowler, along with Dr. Nii Quartelai Quartey and Jehmu Greene, and we are just seconds away from this primetime hearing beginning. The witnesses have already been seated, and now we are waiting for the committee to join us. Jehmu, what are you looking forward to in this hearing as it begins to start?
More drama. It's really been a roller coaster. And I have to say that when we first started that first primetime hearing, I really didn't know what to expect, but I certainly was not expecting as much drama. And as we, start tonight, I think just these personal perspectives from former Trump supporters who quit right then in that moment.
Not even supporters; those are staffers. Those are staffers. Those are supporters. They were on payroll.
Yes, staffers who quit day of, right as it was happening. Their inside perspective has just been a kind of mind-blowing, and I think they've actually really been connecting with the American people. And I also, again, just have to applaud, surprisingly, based on my political background, applaud Congresswoman Liz Cheney, applaud Congressman Adam Kinzinger for their role in these hearings, and the fact that we now see a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking where Donald Trump and other Republicans are mad that the minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, didn't have other Republicans on this panel. That was a big mistake they made. So I'm ready for the drama.
That was a fatal political error on the hand of minority leader Kevin McCarthy. Nii Quartelai, in the next couple of seconds before we begin, what are you looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to seeing the outtakes from Donald Trump's video message to his supporters after the insurrection. I'm looking forward to hearing what the Secret Service, how they're going to respond to the crazy situation they find themselves in, where there are text messages that are nowhere to be found. I think they've only produced one out of a great many, and so. Fasten your seatbelt. I think this is going to be there's going to be a series of bombshells that are going to come out tonight.
Well, fasten your seatbelt, folks, as we put our pedal to the gas metal, and let's get into the chamber as these hearings begin.
He emphatically commanded the heavily armed mob to fight like hell. For the weeks between November election and January 6th, Donald Trump was a force to be reckoned with. He shrugged off the factuality and legality correct, sober advice of his knowledgeable and sensible advisors. Instead, he recklessly blazed a path of lawlessness and corruption the cost to which democracy be damned. And then he stopped. For 187 minutes on January 6th, this man of unbridled destructive energy could not be moved, not by his aides, not by his allies, not by the violent chants of rioters or the desperate pleas of those facing down the riot. And more tellingly, Donald Trump ignored and disregarded the desperate pleas of his own
the January 6th committee. That's the voice of Representative Thompson that you can hear. We want to remind you that he is not in the chamber because he tested positive for COVID-19.
And let's get back to
He could not be moved to rise from his dining room table and walk the few steps down the White House hallway into the press briefing room where cameras were anxiously and desperately waiting to carry his message to the armed and violent mob, savagely beating and killing law enforcement officers, revenging the Capitol, and hunting down the Vice President and various members of Congress. He could not be moved. This evening, my colleagues, Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois and Ms. Luria of Virginia, will take you inside the White House during those 187 minutes. We also remember what was happening at the Capitol minute by minute as the final violent, tragic part of Donald Trump's scheme to cling to power unraveled while he ignored his advisors, stood by and watched it unfold on television. Let me offer a final thought about the Select Committee's work so far. As we've made clear throughout these hearings, our investigation goes forward. We continue to receive new information every day. We continue to hear from witnesses. We will reconvene in September to continue laying out our findings to the American people. But as that work goes forward, a number of facts are clear. There can be no doubt that there was a coordinated, multi-step effort to overturn an election overseen and directed by Donald Trump. There can be no doubt that he commanded a mob he knew was heavily armed, violent, and angry, to march on the Capitol to try to stop the peaceful transfer of power. And he made targets out of his own vice president and the lawmakers gathered to do the people's work. These facts have gone undisputed. And so there needs to be accountability. Accountability under the law. Accountability to the American people. Accountability at every level, from the local precincts in many states where Donald Trump and his allies attacked election workers for just doing their jobs, all the way up to the Oval Office, where Donald Trump embraced a legal advice of insurrectionists that a federal judge has already said was a coup in search of a legal theory. Our democracy withstood the attack on January 6th. If there's no accountability for January 6th, for every part of this scheme, I fear that we will not overcome the ongoing threat to our democracy. There must be stiff consequences for those responsible. Now I'll turn things over to our vice chair to start telling this story.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Without objection, the presiding officer is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, I announce that the committee has approved the release of the deposition material presented during today's hearing. And let me begin tonight by wishing Chairman Thompson a rapid recovery from COVID. He has expertly led us through 8 hearings release of the deposition material presented during today's hearing. And let me begin tonight by wishing Chairman Thompson a rapid recovery from COVID. He has expertly led us through 8 hearings so far, and he has brought us to the point we are today. In our initial hearing, the chairman and I described what ultimately became Donald Trump's 7-part plan to overturn the 2020 presidential election. a plan stretching from before Election Day through January 6th. At the close of today's hearing, our 9th, we will have addressed each element of that plan. But in the course of these hearings, we have received new evidence, and new witnesses have bravely stepped forward. Efforts to litigate and overcome immunity and executive privilege claims have been successful, and those continue. Doors have opened, new subpoenas have been issued, and the dam has begun to break. And now, even as we conduct our 9th hearing, we have considerably more to do. We have far more evidence to share with the American people and more to gather. So our committee will spend August pursuing emerging information on multiple fronts before convening further hearings this September. Today, we know far more about the President's plans and actions to overturn the election than almost all members of Congress did when President Trump was impeached on January 13th, 2021, or when he was tried by the Senate in February of that year. 57 of 100 senators voted to convict President Trump at that time, and more than 20 others said they were voting against conviction because the president's term had already expired. At the time, the Republican leader of the United States Senate said this about Donald Trump.
A mob was assaulting the Capitol in his name. These criminals were carrying his banners, hanging his flags, and screaming their loyalty to him. It was obvious that only President Trump could end this. He was the only one.
Leader McConnell reached those conclusions based on what he knew then, without any of the much more detailed evidence you will see today. Lawlessness and violence began at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, before 1 p.m., and continued until well after darkness fell. What exactly was our Commander-in-Chief doing during the hours of violence? Today, we address precisely that issue. Everything you've heard in these hearings thus far will help you understand President Trump's motives during the violence. You already know Donald Trump's goal: to halt or delay Congress's official proceedings to count certified electoral votes. You know that Donald Trump tried to pressure his vice president to illegally reject votes and delay the proceedings. You know he tried to convince state officials and state legislators to flip their electoral votes from Biden to Trump. And you know Donald Trump tried to corrupt our Department of Justice to aid his scheme. But by January 6th, none of that had worked. Only one thing was succeeding on the afternoon of January 6th. Only one thing was achieving President Trump's goal. The angry, armed mob President Trump sent to the Capitol broke through security, invaded the Capitol, and forced the vote counting to stop. That mob was violent and destructive, and many came armed. As you will hear, Secret Service agents protecting the vice president were exceptionally concerned about his safety and their own. Republican leader Kevin McCarthy was scared, as were others in Congress, even those who themselves helped to provoke the violence.
Before we take a break,
as you will see today, Donald Trump's
Melanie
own White House counsel, his own White House staff,
has to say, as she has been running the incredible organization, the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. She's the president and CEO. Let's hear from Melanie and what she has to say about the committee hearings and what's at stake for Black Americans.
I just want to put this message out here. Everybody listening, we are in a state of emergency. Our democracy is under attack. And we know that from these January 6th hearings that are taking place about the insurrection of the folks wanting to come to the Capitol and take over the federal government. And why was that? Because Black and brown people turned out to vote. And so what that's about is saying that our votes don't count. And so we have to take this moment where we have an opportunity to vote like our lives depend on it, because they do. Yes, we have a lot of challenges that we are facing. And part of that is that voting rights are under attack, our rights, our freedoms are under attack. All the more reason that we own our power and show up in record numbers so that we can make sure that this country remains a democracy. It's just that serious. Get involved.
Preserve, protect.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. Before we go back inside the chamber, Dr. Quartey has some initial thoughts on how it's going.
I mean, just the initial thought I have is, who would have ever thought that the first witness against former President Trump in this primetime hearing would be none other than the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. I thought that was a pretty interesting start. And, we're only a little over 15 minutes into the primetime hearing.
Let's go back inside the chamber.
And so evil. I know how you feel. But go home and go home in peace.
By that time, 2 pipe bombs had been found at locations near the Capitol, including where the vice president-elect was conducting a meeting. Hours of hand-to-hand combat had seriously injured scores of law enforcement officers. The Capitol had been invaded, the electoral count had been halted as members were evacuated. Rioters took the floor of the Senate. They rifled through desks and broke into offices, and they nearly caught up to Vice President Pence. Guns were drawn on the House floor, and a rioter was shot attempting to infiltrate the chamber. We know that a number of rioters intended acts of physical violence against specific elected officials. We know virtually all the rioters were motivated by President Trump's rhetoric that the election had been stolen, and they felt they needed to take their country back. This hearing is principally about what happened inside of the White House that afternoon. From the time when President Trump ended his speech until the moment when he finally told the mob to go home. A span of 187 minutes, more than 3 hours. What you will learn is that President Trump sat in his dining room and watched the attack on television, while his senior-most staff, closest advisors, and family members begged him to do what is expected of any American president. I served proudly for 20 years as an officer in the United States Navy. Veterans of our armed forces know firsthand the leadership that's required in a time of crisis, urgent and decisive action that puts duty and country first. But on January 6th, when lives and our democracy hung in the balance, President Trump refused to act because of his selfish desire to stay in power. And I yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Loria. 1 week after the attack, Republican leader Kevin McCarthy acknowledged the simple truth. President Trump should have acted immediately to stop the violence. During our investigation, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, also remarked on the president's failure to act. Let's hear what they had to say.
The president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack on Congress by mob rioters. He should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding. These facts require immediate action by President Trump.
Yeah, you're the commander-in-chief. You got an assault going on the Capitol of the United States of America. And there's nothing. No call, nothing, zero.
Like my colleague from Virginia, I'm a veteran. I served in the Air Force, and I serve currently in the Air National Guard. I can tell you that General Milley's reaction to President Trump's conduct is 100% correct, and so was Leader McCarthy's. What explains President Trump's behavior? Why did he not take immediate action in a time of crisis? Because President Trump's plan for January 6th was to halt or delay Congress's official proceeding to count the votes. The mob attacking the Capitol quickly caused the evacuation of both the House and the Senate. The count ground to an absolute halt and was ultimately delayed for hours. The mob was accomplishing President Trump's purpose, so of course he didn't intervene. Here's what will be clear by the end of this hearing. President Trump did not fail to act during the 187 minutes between leaving the ellipse and telling the mob to go home. He chose not to act. But there were hundreds that day who honored their oaths and put their lives on the line to protect the people inside the Capitol and to safeguard our democracy. Many of them are here tonight with us, and many more are watching from home. As you already know, and we'll see again tonight, their service and sacrifice shines a bright light on President Trump's dishonor and dereliction of duty. I yield to the Vice Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinzinger. I'd like to begin by welcoming our witnesses this evening. Tonight we're joined by Mr. Matthew Pottinger. Mr. Pottinger is a decorated former Marine intelligence officer who served this nation on tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq. He served in the Trump White House from the first day of the administration through the early morning hours of January 7th, 2021. The last role in which he served in the White House was as Deputy National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. We're also joined by Sarah Matthews. Ms. Matthews started her career in communications, working on Capitol Hill, serving on the Republican staffs of several House committees. She then worked as Deputy Press Secretary for President Trump's re-election campaign before joining the Trump White House in June of 2020. She served there as Deputy Press Secretary and Special Assistant to the President until the evening of January 6th, 2021. I will now swear in our witnesses. The witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you swear or affirm, under penalty of perjury, that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated, and let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you both again for being here tonight. Mr. Pottinger, thank you for your service to the nation as well as for joining us this evening. Can you please briefly explain what your responsibilities were as Deputy National Security Advisor to the President?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. When I started at the White House, I was a senior director for Asia on the National Security Council staff, so that was a job that involved helping coordinate the President's Asia policy. I supported the President when he met or interacted with Asian leaders. Later, 2019, I was promoted to the job of Deputy National Security Advisor. In that role, I was the chairman of the Deputies Committee. That's an NSC meeting of all of the deputy cabinet secretaries. We would settle important matters of national policy related to our national security, and we would also tee up options for the President and for his cabinet members. It was, I felt then, as I do now, that it was a privilege to serve in the White House. I'm also very proud of President Trump's foreign policy accomplishments. We were able to finally compete with China. We were also able to broker peace agreements between Israel and 3 Arab states. I mean, those are some examples of the types of policies that I think made our country safer.
Thank you, Mr. Pottinger. And were you in the White House during the attack on the Capitol on January 6th?
For most of the day, I was in the White House, although when the President was speaking at the rally, I was actually off-site at a scheduled meeting with India's ambassador to the United States. The National Security Council staff was not involved in organizing the security for what was a domestic event, the rally, but I did return to the White House at roughly 2:30 p.m.
Thank you, and I know my colleagues will have additional questions for you about that afternoon. Let me turn now to you, Ms. Matthews. How did you come to join President Trump's White House staff?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. As you outlined, I am a lifelong Republican, and I joined the Trump re-election campaign in June of 2019. I was one of the first communications staffers actually on board for his re-election campaign. And during that time, I traveled all around the country and met Kayleigh McEnany, who was also working on his reelection campaign. I worked there for a year, and I formed a close relationship with Miss McEnany, and she moved over to the White House in April of 2020 to start as White House press secretary, and she brought over a group of campaign staff with her, and so I joined her over at the White House in June of 2020 to start as her deputy.
And were you, Ms. Matthews, at work in the White House on January 6th?
Yes, I was working out of the West Wing that day.
Thank you. And now I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Virginia and the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. As you've seen in our prior hearings, President Trump summoned the mob to D.C. on January 6th. Before he went on stage, he knew some of them were armed and prepared for combat. During his speech, he implored them to march to the Capitol, as he had always planned to do. By the time he walked off the stage, his supporters had already breached the outer perimeter of the Capitol at the foot of Capitol Hill. Since our last hearings, we've received new testimony from a security professional working in the White House complex on January 6th, with access to relevant information and responsibility to report to national security officials. This security official told us that the White House was aware of multiple reports of weapons in the crowd that morning. We as a committee are cognizant of the fear of retribution expressed by certain national security witnesses who have come forward to tell the truth. We've therefore taken steps to protect this national security.
You are watching our live coverage of the January 6th hearing. Already we're learning so much about Sarah Matthews and Matthew Pottinger, who are testifying right now before the committee. I'm really sort of taken by the fact that Sarah Matthews, she is a proud Republican. She calls herself a lifelong Republican who was very close with Kayleigh McEnany, the former White House press secretary. Was working out of the West Wing on the day of the insurrection. And then we heard from Matthew Pottinger. We heard him sort of touting how proud he was of Trump's foreign policy accomplishments and how he was at a meeting with the Indian ambassador to the United States at the time. My big takeaway from, these beginning minutes of their testimony is that there's no axe to grind here. That these folks were firmly planted in Trump world. And so, when Republicans, particularly the former president, likes to say this is nothing but a political witch hunt, it's not feeling like that at all.
I think that's right, Dr. Quartey. Now, as you know, I'm somebody who I'm a man about Washington and sort of have friends on both sides of the aisle. So I know Kayleigh McEnany very well. And I also have met Miss Sarah Matthews before. So these people aren't these aren't the folks that are trying to throw Donald Trump under the bus for political sake. Both her and the former national security advisor make it very clear in their testimony. And I think how Vice Chair Liz Cheney lines that up so well is to make it very clear. Listen, these aren't people that have an axe to grind. These aren't disgruntled employees. These are individuals that have a long history in the Republican Party, are proud of the 4 years of work they did under Donald Trump. In the case of Ms. Matthews, 2 years she did under the reelection campaign and her 1 year stint at the White House. But yet still, where they fell out of love with Donald Trump had everything to do with his actions, or better yet, lack thereof activity on January 6th in particular, as they were invading the Capitol, as they were stopping the count for the Electoral College. And that's, I think, where this makes a bad turn for Trump. And I think where it makes a bad turn for Republicans, because what Liz Cheney's asking Republicans to do in this moment is, which side are you on? Are you on the side of Sarah Matthews, who's a Republican who believes the big lie is just that, a big lie? Or are you on the side of the former president, who to this day, as we found out just yesterday, was calling members in the Wisconsin state legislature to try to overturn the vote there?
Let's go back into the chamber. I want to hear what Congressman Thompson is saying as he joins us, recovering with COVID.
Argument or discussion about going to the Capitol. About how many times would you say you've been part of that motorcade with the president?
Probably over 100 times.
And in that 100 times, have you ever witnessed another discussion of an argument or heated discussion with the president where the president was contradicting where he was supposed to go or what the Secret Service believed was safe?
No.
Like other witnesses, Sergeant Robinson also testified that he was aware that individuals in the crowd were armed.
Yes, I believe he was on Special Events Channel, and I was monitoring the traffic, and so I could hear some of the units pointing out to individuals that there were individuals along Constitution Avenue that were armed, that were up in the trees, and I can hear the units responding to those individuals. And so there's always a concern when there's a protest in the area.
And like other witnesses, Sergeant Robinson told us that the president still wanted to travel to the Capitol, even after returning to the White House.
So at the end of the speech, what was the plan supposed to be?
So at the end of the speech, we do know that while inside the limo, the president was still adamant about going to the Capitol. That's being relayed to me by the TS agent. And so we did part the ellipse and we responded back to the White House. However, the motorcade, the protest motorcade was placed on standby. And so we were told to stand by on West Exec until they confirmed whether or not the president was going to go to the Capitol. And so I may have waited, I would just estimate maybe 45 minutes to an hour, waiting for Secret Service to make that decision.
The motorcade waited at the White House for more than 45 minutes before being released. The committee is also aware that accounts of the angry confrontation in the presidential SUV have circulated widely among the Secret Service since January 6th. Recent disclosures have also caused the committee to subpoena yet further information from the Secret Service, which we've begun to receive and will continue to assess. The committee is also aware that certain Secret Service witnesses have now retained new private counsel. We anticipate further testimony under oath and other new information in the coming weeks. After the Secret Service refused to take President Trump to the Capitol, he returned to the White House. What you see on the screen is a photo of him inside the Oval Office immediately after he returned from the rally, still wearing his overcoat. A White House employee informed the president as soon as he returned to the Oval about the riot at the Capitol. Let me repeat that. Within 15 minutes of leaving the stage, President Trump knew that the Capitol was besieged and under attack. At 1:25, President Trump went to the private dining room off the Oval Office. From 1:25 until 4 o'clock, the president stayed in his dining room. Just to give you a sense of where the dining room is situated in the West Wing, let's take a look at this floor plan. The dining room is connected to the Oval Office by a short hallway. Witnesses told us that on January 6th, President Trump sat in his usual spot at the head of the table facing a television hanging on the wall. We know from the employee that the TV was tuned to Fox News all afternoon. Here you can see Fox News on the TV showing coverage of the joint session that was airing that day at 1:25. Other witnesses confirmed that President Trump was in the dining room with the TV on for more than 2.5 hours. There was no official record of what President Trump did while in the dining room. On the screen is the presidential call log from January 6th. As you can see, there's no official record of President Trump receiving or placing a call between 11:06 and 6:54 p.m. As to what the president was doing that afternoon, the presidential daily diary is also silent. It contains no information from the period between 1:21 p.m. and 4:03 p.m. There are also no photos of President Trump during this critical period between 1:21 in the Oval Office and when he went outside to the Rose Garden after 4 o'clock. The chief White House photographer wanted to take pictures because it was in her words, very important for his archives and for history. But she was told, quote, no photographs. Despite the lack of photos or an official record, we've learned what President Trump was doing while he was watching TV in the dining room. But before we get into that, it's important to understand what he never did that day. Let's watch.
So are you aware of any phone call by the President of the United States to the Secretary of Defense that day?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Are you aware of any phone call by the President of the United States to the Attorney General of the United States that day?
No.
Are you aware of any phone call by the President of the United States to the Secretary of Homeland Security that day?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Did you ever hear the President
No.
ask for the National
No.
Guard? Did you ever hear the President ask for law enforcement response?
No.
So as somebody who works in the national security space and with the National Security Council, if there were going to be troops present or called up for a rally in Washington, D.C., for example, is that something that you would have been aware of?
Yeah, I would have.
Do you know if he asked anybody to reach out to any of those that we just listed off? National Guard, DOD, FBI, Homeland Security, Secret Service, Mayor Bowser, the Capitol Police, about the situation in the Capitol?
I am not aware of any of those requests. No, sir.
We have confirmed in numerous interviews with senior law enforcement and military leaders, Vice President Pence's staff and D.C. government officials. None of them, not one, heard from President Trump that day. He did not call to issue orders. He did not call to offer assistance. This week, we received additional testimony from yet another witness about why the president didn't make any efforts to quell the attack. The former White House employee with national security responsibilities told us about a conversation with senior advisor Eric Hirschman and Pat Cipollone, the top White House lawyer. This conversation was about a pending call.
We're about to take a quick break, but I just want to clarify that was not Congressman Benny Thompson, as I said. That was actually Sergeant Robinson from the D.C. Police Department, corroborating what we've heard about those Secret Service shenanigans and the president lunging at them. We will be right back with Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. We are hearing quite a lot. I was really taken aback at just sort of the gap in activity. The fact that from 11:06 a.m. To 6:54 p.m. there were no calls in the presidential call log. We're seeing that there's some significant gaps. The White House photographer was told no photographs in the White House of the president after he'd come back from that January 6th rally. And some pretty compelling testimony from Sergeant Robinson. Richard, you were pretty taken by that.
Yeah, a couple of things here. I think number one, everything you just said, but I think one of the reasons for that is the fact that we know that Donald Trump, we know this from the impeachment hearings, that Donald Trump was using a cell phone and not the White House phone, which is actually completely outside of presidential protocols, right? Because every time the president makes a phone call, it's not, and I think this is very important for the soulmates at home to understand this, it's not Donald Trump making a phone call, it's the president of the United States making a phone call, and those phone calls must be logged for history's sake, right? And so it's interesting that there's nothing on the call log, but I think the other thing that's also interesting here is in the testimony of Sergeant Robinson, the officer from the Metropolitan Police Department, from DC's Metropolitan Police Department, you hear him walk through what normally happens when the president's moving in the motorcade in Washington, D.C. As somebody who's lived in the city for a long time, who understands the movement of presidents like we all do on this panel, we know these moves are very coordinated. The president doesn't wake up in the morning and decide he's going to go out to McDonald's. These things have to happen days, sometimes weeks in advance. And so the fact that you have the presidential motorcade idling for 45 minutes to an hour on standby is not only uncharacteristic, but it's something that really doesn't jive with normal presidential movements. And for all those folks who's watching us on the YouTube chat, thank you for your comments. We appreciate them. They're pretty dope. And continue commenting, and we will take some of your comments live on the air, hopefully, in the next segment.
Jehmu,
what we've got so far, the drama has certainly started. We've got burner phones. We've got no photos for a president who we all know, Donald Trump. He wanted his picture taken and wanted to be in front of a camera 24/7. I think that really does play into what this committee has set out to do from the very beginning, which was to show that this was premeditated, that this was planned in advance. When you have the burner phones set to go, when you have instructions to the White House photographer, no pictures, none of this feels like it was happening just in the moment, and certainly is contrary, as Richard said, to the normal happenings of the White House and the people who protect the president.
And just to add to that, the fact that he never called the defense secretary, he never called the Secretary of Homeland Security. He sat in the dining room in the White House watching Fox News. And, some folks are saying he called some Republican senators to encourage them to overturn the election had already been lost. I mean, this is a president that didn't seem interested in keeping the American people safe. Right there in his backyard.
I think that's absolutely right. I want a big shout out to Naquija Burns, who's watching our program, who says she doesn't have television, but she thanks Fox Soul for providing this live coverage. And for you, Ms. Burns, we're going to go right back into the chamber.
I don't know the private conversation she had with Mr. Trump, but I remember when she came to the office one time with White House counsel's office, when she came to the chief of staff's office with White House counsel's office, she was talking about the speech later that day and trying to get her dad on board with saying something that was more direct than he had wanted to at the time and throughout the afternoon.
And I think Mark also I remember him getting Ivanka involved because it's like, get Ivanka down here because he thought that would be important. I don't think Jared was there in the morning, but I think he came later. I remember thinking it was important to get him in there too. And of course, Pat Philbin, was expressing the same things. I mean, Pat Philbin, was very, as I said, I don't think there was one of these meetings where there might have been, but for the most part, I remember the both of us going down together, going back, getting on phone calls. He was also very clearly expressing this view.
Pat Cipollone and Cassidy Hutchinson, an aide to Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, also told us about the Hang Mike Pence chants. As you will see, Mr. Cipollone recalled conversations about those chants in the West Wing, but he relied on executive privilege to maintain confidentiality over his and others' direct communications with the president. Although Mr. Cipollone was unwilling to provide more detail, Ms. Hutchison provided more explicit information, filling in those blanks. See that for yourself.
It wasn't until Mark hung up the phone, handed it back to me. I went back to my desk. A couple minutes later, him and Pat came back, possibly Eric Hirschman too. I'm pretty sure Eric Hirschman was there. But I'm confident it was Pat that was there. I remember Pat saying something to the effect of, Mark, we need to do something more. They're literally calling for the vice president to be effing hung. And Mark had responded something to the effect of, you heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. To which Pat said something, this is effing crazy. We need to be doing something more. Briefly stepped into Mark's office.
Do you remember any discussion at any point during the day about rioters at the Capitol chanting, hang Mike Pence?
Yes, I remember hearing that about that. Yes. Yeah. I don't know if I observed that myself on TV yet.
I'm just curious. I understand the privilege line you've drawn, but do you remember what you can share with us about the discussion about those chants, the hang Mike Pence chants?
I can tell you my view of that.
Yeah, please.
My view of that is outrageous. And for anyone to suggest such a thing as the Vice President of the United States, for people in that crowd to be chanting that, I thought it was terrible. I thought it was outrageous and wrong. And I expressed that very clearly.
With respect to your conversations with Mr. Meadows, though, did you specifically raise a concern of the Vice President with him, and how did he respond?
I believe I raised a concern about the Vice President, and I again, the nature of his response, without recalling exactly, was people were doing all that they could.
And what about the President? Did he indicate whether he thought the President was doing what needed to be done to protect the Vice President?
Yeah, just sir. That question.
Call for production. Yeah. Okay. I'm being instructed on it.
I see.
In addition, Mr. Cipollone testified that it would have been feasible, as commentators on television were suggesting, for President Trump to immediately appear at the podium in the press room to address the nation.
Would it have been possible at any moment for the president to walk down to the podium in the briefing room and talk to the nation at any time between when you first gave him that advice at 2:00 and 4:17 when the video statement? Would that have been possible?
Would it have been possible?
Yes.
Yes, it would have been possible.
We just heard Mr. Cipollone say that President Trump could have gone to the press briefing room to issue a statement at any moment. To give you a sense of just how easy that would have been, let's take a look at a map of the West Wing. As we saw earlier, the president's private dining room is at the bottom of the map. The press briefing room is at the top, highlighted in blue. And the Rose Garden, where the president ultimately filmed his go home video, is on the right next to the Oval Office, and that's highlighted in green. Ms. Matthews, how quickly could the president have gotten on camera in the press briefing room to deliver a statement to the nation?
So as you outlined, it would take probably less than 60 seconds from the Oval Office dining room over to the press briefing room. And for folks that might not know, the briefing room is the room that you see the White House press secretary do briefings from, with the podium and the blue backdrop. And there's a camera that is on in there at all times. And so if the president had wanted to make a statement and address the American people, he could have been on camera almost instantly. And conversely, the White House press corps has offices that are located directly behind the briefing room. And so if he had wanted to make an address from the Oval Office, we could have assembled the White House press corps probably in a matter of minutes to get them into the Oval for him to do an on-camera address.
Thank you. Other witnesses have given us their views on the question.
Back to the Fox Soul Live coverage of the January 6th primetime hearing. There's an interesting point here that Sarah Matthews brings up that I think it's really important for the Soulmates to understand. At any particular time in the presidency of the United States, especially in modern times, there is always members of the press located at the Brady press room, which is steps away. When I mean steps, I mean it literally is probably a 60-second walk from the Oval Office to the Brady press room. And once you walk into that room, if the president walks into this room, there's a camera there called a pool camera, and that camera literally can interrupt broadcasts and any channel, any network channel, any cable channel, if there's something happening. It's there for cases of emergency, it's there for cases of war, etc. If Donald Trump wanted to stop the invasion of the Capitol, if he wanted to address the nation, what this committee is outlining here very clearly is he could have, by simply walking 60 seconds down to the Brady press room and making a statement to the American people. The other option he has is that at any particular time, the president has what they call a pool, which is one member of the TV press, one member of the print press, one member of the radio press that are with the president 24 hours a day until what we call a lid happens. But they're usually with him during the working hours of the presidency. If he wanted to, he can call the pool and they can set up and take a statement from him at any particular time. He chose not to do that either, which means basically he wanted this to happen.
Well, before we take a break, here's a message from the co-founder of the Black Church PAC, Pastor Michael McBride, on the role that the Black church must play in the fight for our democracy.
I just want to encourage every faith leader, every pastor, every community member, every activist, every organizer, people of faith and goodwill, particularly we who are members and practitioners of the Black church, Black faith community, to not take our eye off the ball related to the January 6th hearings happening right now, literally at the congressional level. The failed insurrection attempt that was spearheaded, orchestrated, and promulgated by the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, and all of his supporters and those in his charge must be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law.
That president.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. Let's get right back into the chamber for our gavel-to-gavel coverage.
Now, you may want to consider getting out and leaving now. Copy?
Will we encounter the people once we make our way?
Repeat?
Encounter any individuals if we made our way to the...
There's 6 officers between us and the people that are 5 to 10 feet away from me.
Stand by, I'm going down to evaluate.
Go ahead.
We have a clear shot if we move quickly. We got smoke downstairs set by unknown smoke set downstairs by the protesters.
Is that route compromised?
We have this is secure. However, we will bypass some protesters that are being contained. There is smoke, unknown what kind of smoke it is. Copy?
Clear, we're coming out now, all right? Make a way.
The President's National Security Council staff was listening to these developments and tracking them in real time. On the screen, you can see excerpts from the chat logs among the President's National Council. At 2:13, the staff learned. 3 minutes later, the staff said the Vice President was being pulled, which meant agents evacuated him from the Senate floor. At 2:24, the staff noted that the Secret Service agents at the Capitol did not, quote, sound good right now. Earlier, you heard from a security professional who had been working in the White House complex on January 6th with access to relevant information and a responsibility to report to national security officials. We asked this person, what was meant by the comment that the Secret Service agents
Don't go away, soulmates, because more coverage of the January 6th committee hearings is coming right up.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. For all of those who are tuning in, thank you so much for joining us on the YouTube chat. A couple comments from the chat. One person writes, I was 5 months pregnant and all I kept thinking is I can't believe that this is real. Somebody else says, I'm an unpaid lobbyist and this is sickening. And somebody else says, thank you so much for your broadcast. And we thank you for watching. Now let's get right back into the chamber as we continue our gavel to gavel coverage.
All million of us. It's insane.
Did people appear angry as you were walking to the Capitol?
Yeah, a lot of people seem like they're very upset.
Tell us some of the things they were saying, if you recall.
Oh, they were saying all types. People were screaming all types of stuff. They were mad that Vice President Pence was going to accept the electorals. It was a little. If you could think it up, you were hearing it.
I believe that
Vice President Pence was going to certify the electoral votes or not certify them, but I guess that's just changed, correct? And it's a very big disappointment. I think there's several 100,000 people here that are very disappointed.
President Trump did not try to calm his thousands of disappointed supporters. Instead, at almost the same moment violence was getting completely out of hand, Donald Trump sent his 224 tweet. The president said, Mike Pence didn't have the courage what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution. Despite knowing the Capitol had been breached and the mob was in the building, President Trump called Mike Pence a coward and placed all the blame on him for not stopping the certification. He put a target on his own vice. About your reaction to seeing the 220.
So Nii Quartelai, so what do you think so far?
I mean, the president laid it on really thick. The fact that his followers showed up in D.C. and they really believed that Mike Pence had quote unquote screwed them. That Mike Pence, because he would not go along with the plan to not certify the election, they were disappointed and fired up and ready to express that in a host of different ways, including, efforts to hang the vice president of the United States. They were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." And so, what the big takeaway for me here is that that's not new news. For those of us that were in Washington, D.C. the day of the insurrection, we heard it then. And it's still just as chilling hearing it now. The fact that there were nooses that were strung up outside the Capitol, especially resonates, with me as a black man. Because if they were willing to use a noose against the Vice President of the United States, then, none of us were safe on Capitol Hill that day. And so really just sort of taken by this shameful reminder of the state of our democracy on that day. And it just drives home the point that we can't turn away from this. And for us to go through these hearings, for us to go through these proceedings, and if the end result is zero accountability for the person stirring the pot, the former commander-in-chief, then we're in a world of trouble.
Jehmu, I mean, I think Nii Quartelai brings up a good point, right? Because the fact that these insurrectionists were allowed to sort of erect nooses and we hear that they had smoke in the chamber, and there clearly seems to be a lot of preparation here. So this just wasn't happenstance. This was very well prepared, no?
We absolutely are seeing evidence of just how well prepared it was. And that preparation was on the behalf of very organized, very strategic white supremacist organizations and white nationalist organizations who have actually been doing this in many states leading up to the January 6th insurrection. They have a lot of practice at the different, even like vaccine protests. There was a lot of coordination that we saw from these white supremacist groups where they have been infiltrating different gatherings. They've, kind of even at times taken off their badges, taken off like things that like will very sharply identify them as being white supremacists. This was very planned. On the other side, we are starting to see this strategy of the committee, I think, really hit home. We can't miss the fact that we saw the star witness of these hearings make a comeback, Cassidy Hutchinson. I really think her testimony, several days ago really was the turning point in these hearings where more Americans started paying attention. And so we saw her come back in tonight's hearing for some more video of her deposition. And we've even polls polls that show her approval ratings to be higher than President Biden's and higher than former President Trump. we are definitely getting a clearer sense of those 187 minutes. Maybe we'll get Snoop to do a remix. 187 on our democracy is kind of how I'm thinking of those 187 minutes, and just looking forward to again just how strategic this committee is being. And as Congresswoman Cheney laid out at the beginning of these hearings, we're going to get to do this all over again in September because there's more evidence out there. I'm very impressed with how meticulous they are being in this process.
I think that's right. I mean, both Cassidy Hutchinson as well as Sarah Matthews seem to have more courage than some sitting members of the United States Congress, some cabinet secretaries, and a lot of other folks who are in Trump world. But let's get back to the gavel-to-gavel coverage as we continue to watch a January 6th hearing.
During this chaos, what did President Trump do at that point? He went back to calling senators to try to further delay the electoral count. While the vice president was being evacuated from the Senate, President Trump called Senator Tommy Tuberville, one of his strongest supporters in the Senate. As Senator Tuberville later recalled, he had to end the call so that he could evacuate the Senate chamber himself. Let's listen.
He didn't call my phone, called somebody else, and they handed it to me. And I basically told him, I said, Mr. President, we're not doing much work here right now because they just took our vice president out. And matter of fact, I'm going to have to hang up on you. I've got to leave.
Senator Josh Hawley also had to flee. Earlier that afternoon, before the joint session started, he walked across the east front of the Capitol. As you can see in this photo, he raised his fist in solidarity with the protesters already amassing at the security gates. We spoke with a Capitol police officer who was out there at the time. She told us that Senator Hawley's gesture riled up the crowd, and it bothered her greatly because he was doing it in a safe space, protected by the officers and the barriers. Later that day, Senator Hawley fled after those protesters he helped to rile up stormed the Capitol. See for yourself. Think about what we've seen. Undeniable violence at the Capitol. The vice president being evacuated to safety by the Secret Service. Senators running through the hallways of the Senate to get away from the mob. As the commander-in-chief, President Trump was oath and duty bound to protect the Capitol. His senior staff understood that.
Do you believe, Jared, that the president has an obligation to ensure a peaceful transfer of power?
Yes.
And do you think the president has an obligation to defend all three branches of our government?
I believe so.
And I assume you also would agree the president has a particular obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
That is one of the president's obligations, correct?
No, I mean, I asked what his duty is.
Well, I mean, there's a constitutional duty. What he has, he's the commander-in-chief. And that was that was my biggest issue with him as national security advisor.
Rather than uphold his duty to the Constitution, President Trump allowed the mob to achieve the delay that he hoped would keep him in power. I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. I request that those in the hearing room remain seated.
We are going to take a quick break and come back with Foxhole's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings.
Welcome back to Foxhole's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. Wow, we are about an hour and a half in, and what a hearing it has been. Jehmu, I see you're still here. You're not running, so you're like Josh Hawley. Tell me your take so far.
Wow, I think they did a really good job following Senator Josh Hawley's fleeing through the Capitol after he threw up his fist sign. And, it's just another example that they've really highlighted well, including, really showing the tweet that President Trump did that actually riled up the crowd. Instead of choosing to, as you said, Richard, go the 60 seconds down the hall to the press briefing room, he chose to send out a tweet that basically put Mike Pence under even more of a spotlight and said that he wasn't with them. So just kind of these reminders in really visual ways, I think is doing a good job of telling this story. But I imagine there are going to be some folks who are putting together some ads against Senator Hawley, and will be using those clips of him running for safety after he riled up that crowd outside the Capitol.
Nii Quartelai, what's your take so far? What's one of your biggest takeaways as we are sort of at the first recess of this primetime hearing?
If your grandmother is anything like my grandmother, she probably warns you of folks that are sometimey. And I think we just saw an illustration of that in the evidence presented this evening at the primetime hearing, where we saw Senator Hawley really behave in a sometimey kind of way. So on one hand, he's outside the Capitol cheering on the insurrectionist. And then inside the Capitol, he's running for safety. And so who's the real Josh Hawley? Who's the real Senator Hawley? It's the sometimey Senator Hawley. Sometimes he's with you and sometimes he's not with you. And it's going to be interesting to see, whether or not, any of these facts, these insights persuade the insurrectionists themselves. We've heard stories since these hearings have begun of some insurrectionists expressing some regret, and not just the folks that are being prosecuted, but for folks that claim to be a part of sort of the MAGA movement, some few, but some sort of seemingly coming to their senses. And so, I'm wondering, what are they thinking, feeling, and experiencing, knowing what was happening behind the scenes after having heard President Trump at that rally, saying, hey, I'm going to march with you. And he never came with them. Seeing Josh Hawley, Senator Josh Hawley, cheering him on and then running for safety. I wonder if any of them are watching this and saying, wait a minute, there's a lot of double talk happening here. Maybe we're just being used.
I think double talk is the understatement here, Dr. Quartey, if you really think about it, because even in the imagery of Josh Hawley holding up the fist, he was still protected, right? If you notice from the testimony, what you find is he was on the other side of the police barricades as he was sort of cheering on the folks on the side of the folks who are getting ready to invade the Capitol. Same goes for Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump wanted the magnetometers to come down, but yet still, Donald Trump is protected by a security detail that has enough weapons with it to blow up the Taliban. So you have, in both of these instances, you have officials who are cheering these crowds on, who are protected, who are sort of inoculated from anything that could possibly happen to them, right? And so while some of these insurrectionists are behind bars today, not too far from where any of us live, because the District of Columbia is not that big of a place, in DC jail, Josh Hawley is walking around as a free man. So is Donald Trump. So are the Trump children. So is Mitch McConnell. So are many of the members of Congress that were part of edging on this insurrection. So ask yourself the question, to your point, when you say sometime, and only they sometime, but who's the real folks being punished here? Is it the insurrectionists or the people who caused the insurrection, which are Donald Trump and his acolytes on Capitol Hill?
Let's be clear. Josh Hawley is planning his presidential campaign.
That part.
And throwing up that fist, that was definitely his intention. He's trying to tap into that community. I think it's going to backfire on him because images don't lie. We saw him running like a scared kitten out of that Capitol after trying to put up that fist and be all strong. That is going to last forever.
And you're
giving kittens a bad name.
You definitely are. And here's the truth. Josh Hawley has a history beyond this moment of attacking Black women. Just last week, in a hearing around reproductive rights, he attacked a professor from California, Professor Bridges, when she was talking about the importance of bringing non-binary folks and trans folks and Black women to the conversation around reproductive health. And he straight out attacked her and ridiculed her. He also is famous for attacking Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in her hearing. So his history of going after Black folks and cheering on white folks in the Capitol is very clear and very evident here.
Yeah.
And we are going to take a quick break, but before we go, here is a message from former Ohio State Senator Nina Turner on why it is important for the Black community to pay attention to the January 6th hearing.
We know that President Donald J. Trump is complicit in the actions that took place on January 6th, and we must ensure that action is taken and that these hearings are not just a dog and pony show. We need the African American community to pay close attention to these hearings and make a demand that our elected officials ensure that there are consequences for the actions that people took on January the 6th, including President Donald J. Trump. If we do not, our democracy is in peril. It will only embolden others to do something like this again. And we, yes, the collective we, cannot stand by or sit by idly and allow oligarchy to take reign over the United States of America. So let's get in this fight, pay attention, get involved, and let's make a demand.
Welcome back to Fox Soul special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. Let's talk a little bit about what we've heard so far. So we've heard from Sarah Matthews. We've also heard from Matt Pottinger. Nii Quartelai, what stands out to you from these two witnesses, both former White House employees, both proud of their time serving and working under the Trump administration and the policy achievements made there, but yet still have parted ways with the president because of his behavior on January 6th?
What stands out the most to me, based on the testimony that we've seen thus far, is the demeanor of the witnesses today. They are very calm, very cool, very collected. I don't see any sort of Saturday Night Live skit emerging from their testimony today. They seem to have been, in the Trump administration for what they thought were the right reasons. They seem to be loyal to Trump, but it seems that their loyalty, is not a blind loyalty. Hence, why they are, why it seems they've been compelled, or at least partly why they've been compelled to testify today. They're kind of giving it to us straight, no chaser. I don't get the sense that they are trying to win a Profile and Courage award, nor are they, trying to be a demonstration of blind loyalty. And so that's what has really caught my attention thus far.
And what say you, Jehmu, about these two witnesses? I mean, because to Nii Quartelai's point, many of them, this is especially for Sarah Matthews, it's very unlikely that she will have another job in Republican politics, just like Cassidy Hutchinson, after she decided to do this.
Well, I think for so many of us, going back to when President Trump was inaugurated and when just the tsunami of unbelievable actions on his behalf, when he said there were, good people on both sides after you had white supremacists marching through the streets in Virginia with pitchforks, when he was, basically providing information to Putin in ways that were unacceptable. There were all of these moments throughout his presidency where normal, everyday, regular Americans were looking, really hoping that somewhere within his infrastructure, you would find Republicans who would put country first. And day after day, week after week, year after year, it was impossible to find those Republicans. And then January 6th happened. And you have people like Matthew Pottinger, like Sarah Matthews, like Cassidy Hutchinson, who finally said, I have to put country first. And I think we all can agree, better late than never. But I hope one of the outcomes of this hearing is a real clear lesson around how you can't wait until until the insurrection happens. We had enough clues that we needed people within his administration, people who were on his staff to be putting country first. So while it's refreshing to see both Pottinger and Sarah Matthews having done that on January 6th by immediately resigning, by participating in this hearing process, by answering the questions, truthfully, I think all of that is great. But hopefully the lesson coming out of this is, yes, country first. No one is king.
No one is king. I couldn't have said it better myself. And let's go back inside the committee chamber.
I think it's a Godfather reference.
Sean Hannity agreed, and he also turned to Mark Meadows for help after the president's second tweet. As you can see, Mr. Hannity texted at 3:31 to say Trump needed to deliver a statement to the nation telling the rioters to leave the Capitol. Mr. Meadows responded that he was, quote, on it. Don Jr. and Sean Hannity were not the only ones who implored Mr. Meadows.
And so we just saw a clip of Donald Trump Jr. And we're hearing testimony about Mark Meadows, the president's former chief of staff, or former president's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, reportedly texting that he was on top of things. That was it's a series of tweets from a number of folks from the Fox News family. Sean Hannity. We're seeing tweets or text messages from Laura Ingraham, and I think we're really being walked through a series of pieces of evidence that demonstrate how incestuous things were on January 6th. You got folks from the administration that are in communication with folks in the Fourth Estate, folks in media, and it's unclear sort of who's calling the plays. But it is clear that President Trump, the former president, seems to be pulling a lot of strings here, and that's a part of what's on display today. Let's go back into the committee room.
Tell people to go home. Who would you put in that category?
Well, I would put Pat Philbin, Eric Hirschman, overall Mark Meadows, Ivanka. Once Jared got there, Jared, General Kellogg. I'm probably missing some, but those. Kaylee, I think, was there, but I don't. Dan Scavino.
And who on the staff did not want people to leave the Capitol?
On the staff?
In the White House, how about?
I can't think of anybody, on that day who didn't want people to get out of the Capitol particularly once the violence started. No. I mean,
what about the president?
Yeah.
She's the staff. So I answered.
I said in the White House.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I thought you said who else on the staff. I can't reveal indications.
Well, we are hearing from Pat No Snitch Cipollone, the former White House counsel. I find his testimony and also the little bit that we saw from Jared Kushner's to be quite frustrating, where very basic, simple questions coming from the committee around the role of the president to protect the branches of government and the pauses, the long pregnant pauses before you can answer some basic questions. Just going back to what I was saying about putting country first, I don't know why it's so hard for Cipollone to step outside of that bubble that he was in as White House counsel and just, speak the truth, speak truth to power. He definitely seems to be taking this no snitches allowed posture, which is odd for someone of his position. Richard, what do you
know? I think what's interesting about the Pat Cipollone testimony is that we don't really hear from Pat Cipollone until after we hear from Cassidy Hutchinson, right? So Cassidy Hutchinson is the former staff assistant, sort of the right-hand girl to Mark Meadows, who is the chief of staff for the president of the United States at the time, also known, the role is known as the co-president. When she gets brave enough to testify, which was about 2 weeks ago, then after that, all of a sudden, the issues of attorney-client privilege issues go away. The issues of we're not going to abide by the subpoena goes away, and we hear from Pat Cipollone. And what we hear from Pat Cipollone is almost a confirmation of everything that Cassidy Hutchinson had said to the committee in her testimony just a couple weeks ago, which says to me that she was the brave one, and she was almost she was the person who sort of busted it all open. And when she went first, everything followed, which is why I think today we're hearing from Sarah Matthews, as well as the former Deputy National Security Advisor, because this young girl was brave enough, this 20-something-year-old was brave enough to say, I'm going to speak the truth, and I'm going to tell the truth to the American people. And to your point, Jehmu, I'm going to put country over party. And as a result of that, now we're seeing testimony from all these other individuals.
It really seems that there are two rules that are governing this White House. One is snitches get stitches, and the second one is don't ask, don't tell. Those seem to be the two principles that seem to be consistent in the testimony that we've been watching thus far.
And let's go back into the chamber.
Peaceful that he finally agreed to include it.
The president resisted writing "stay peaceful" in a tweet. He told Mark Meadows that the rioters were doing what they should be doing, and the rioters understood they were doing what President Trump wanted them to do. President Trump's message was heard clearly by Stop the Steal organizer Ali Alexander. At 2:38, he told another organizer, quote, "POTUS is not ignorant of what his words would do." Rioters storming the Capitol also heard President Trump's message. In this video, you'll see surveillance footage from the rotunda that shows a group of Oath Keepers, including Jessica Watkins, who's been charged with seditious conspiracy. You'll hear her walkie-talkie communications with others as they share intelligence and communicate about President Trump's 2:38 tweet in real time. Again, we warn the audience that this clip also contains strong language.
CNN just said that they evacuated all members of Congress into a safety room.
There's no safe place in the United States for any of these motherfuckers right now, let me tell you.
I hope they understand that we are not joking around.
Military Principle 105, cave means grave.
Trump just tweeted, "Please support our Capitol Police. They are on our side. Do not harm them."
That's saying a lot by what he didn't say. He didn't say not to do anything to the congressman.
Well, he did not ask them to stand down. He just said, stand by the Capitol Police. They are on our side, and they are good people. So it's getting real down there. I got it on TV, and it's looking pretty friggin' radical to me. CNN said that Trump has egged this on, that he is egging it on, and that he is watching the country burn 2 weeks before he leaves office. He is not leaving office. I don't give a shit what they say.
We are in the mezzanine. We are in the main dome right now. We are rocking it. They're throwing grenades. They're freaking shooting people with paintballs, but we're in here.
Be safe, be safe. God bless and Godspeed, and keep going.
Get it, Jess. Do your shit. This is what we fucking lived up for. Everything we fucking trained for.
Took over the Capitol. Overran the Capitol. We're in the fucking Capitol, bro.
We've now seen how President Trump's supporters reacted to his tweets. Mr. Pottinger, you told us that you consider the tweets sent to this point to be, quote, wholly inadequate given the urgency of the crisis. What, in your view, would have been needed?
Yeah, it was insufficient. I think what you could count me among those who was hoping to see an unequivocal, strong statement clearing out the Capitol, telling people to stand down, leave, go home. I think that's what we were hoping for.
So something a lot more kind of definitive and not ambiguous, because he has that power over his folks. Ms. Matthews, you told us about a colleague who said during the attack that the president should not condemn the violence. Can you please tell us about that moment and your reaction?
Yes, so a conversation started in the press office after the president sent out those 2 tweets that I deemed were insufficient. And a colleague suggested that the president shouldn't condemn the violence because they thought it would be, quote, handing a win to the media if he were to condemn his supporters. And I disagreed. I thought that we should condemn the violence and condemn it unequivocally. And I thought that he needed to include a call to action and to tell these people to go home. And a debate ensued over it. And I became visibly frustrated, and my colleagues were well aware of that. And I couldn't believe that we were arguing over this in the middle of the West Wing, talking about the politics of a tweet, being concerned with handing the media a win when we had just watched all of that violence unfold at the Capitol. And so I motioned up at the TV, and I said, do you think it looks like we're effing winning? Because I don't think it does. And I again reiterated that I thought that the president needed to condemn the violence because it didn't matter if it was coming from the left or the right, that you should condemn violence 100% of the time.
We've heard this evening how everyone in the president's orbit was pushing him to do more, to tell the mob to leave the Capitol. One of those people was Republican leader Kevin McCarthy. He managed to get the president on the phone and told him to call off his supporters. As you will hear, the president refused, and so Leader McCarthy reached out for help to Ivanka Trump, who was at the White House, and Jared Kushner, who that afternoon had just arrived back on a flight from the Middle East.
So at some point in the afternoon, Mr. McCarthy placed a phone call to Mr. Scavino's desk line, and it was transferred to the president. Is that correct?
That's generally what I recall.
Okay. Were you involved in transferring that call?
Yes.
Okay. Where was the president at the time that he took that call?
He was in the dining room.
Would you personally reach out to the president for more support?
I've already talked to the president.
We're taking a break and coming back. We're going to come right back with Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. We're going to take you right back to our gavel coverage in the chamber.
Think about that. Leader McCarthy, who was one of the president's strongest supporters, was scared and begging for help. President Trump turned him down. So he tried to call the president's children. Republican House member Mike Gallagher also implored the president to call off the attack.
Mr. President, you have got to stop this. You are the only person who can call this off. Call it off. The election is over. Call it off.
President-elect Joe Biden also went live on TV to demand that President Trump tell the mob to leave.
I call on President Trump to go on national television now to fulfill his oath and defend the Constitution and demand an end to this siege.
There was a desperate scramble for everyone to get President Trump to do anything. All this occurred, and the president still did not act. I yield to my friend from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. President Trump finally relented to the pleas from his staff, his family, and from Capitol Hill for him to do something more at 4:17. 187 minutes, more than 3 hours after he stopped speaking at the ellipse. After he stopped speaking to a mob to go home, while also telling them that they were special and that he loved them. By that time, the violence was far from over. Law enforcement had started to turn. Reinforcements were on the way. The writing was already on the wall. The rioters would not succeed. Here's what was showing on Fox News, the channel the president was watching all afternoon.
Back to Brett Baer with more information now. Brett, what do you have?
Our Pentagon team, Jen Griffin, Lucas Tomlinson, confirming the Defense Department has now mobilized the entire D.C. National Guard, 1,800 troops. Take several hours, as I was mentioning before, to get them up and running. The Army Secretary Ron McCarthy is setting up a headquarters at the FBI. You just heard from David Spunt that the FBI is also sending troops to the Capitol.
It's no coincidence, then, that President Trump finally gave in and went out to the Rose Garden at 4:03. His staff had prepared a script for him to read, but he refused to use it. As you can see on the screen, you can see the script is stamped "President has seen." The script said, quote, "I'm asking you to leave the capital region now and go home in a peaceful way." The president was urged to stick to this script, but he spoke off the cuff. Eric Hirschman and Nick Luna went with the president to film the message in the Rose Garden. Let's hear what they had to say and see the never-before-seen raw footage of the president recording this video message.
Ultimately, these remarks that we're looking at here in Exhibit 25 were not the remarks that the president delivered in the Rose Garden. Do you know why the president decided not to use these?
I don't know, sir. No, I do not know why.
Did the president use any written remarks to your knowledge, or did he just go off the cuff?
To my knowledge, it was off the cuff, sir.
Good, Chase? When you're ready, sir. Yep, you're right behind me.
You tell me when?
When you're ready, sir.
Who's behind me?
He's gone around. We're all clear now.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had a election. Let me see. I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to respect our great people in law and order. We don't want anybody hurt. It's a very tough period of time. There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election. but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel. But go home and go home in peace.
When I got there, basically the president just had finished filming the video, and I think he was basically retiring for the day.
Was there any discussion about the president releasing a second video that day?
Not that I recall. When he finished his video, I think everyone was like, day's over. People were pretty drained.
Were pretty what?
Drained.
But we say day over. I mean, there were still people in the Capitol at that point, weren't there?
There were people in the Capitol, but I believe by this stage, law enforcement, and I'd have to go back and look, but I believe law enforcement was either there or moving in or going to take charge. I just say people were emotionally drained by the time that videotape was done.
Emotionally drained? At the White House? Here's what was happening at the same time at the Capitol. We warned the audience that this clip also contains strong language and violence.
Hey, keep pushing, don't lose the momentum. You got another officer unconscious.
We need gas masks. We need weapons. We need strong, angry patriots to help our boys. They don't want to leave.
While President Trump refused to even lift another finger to help, other leaders honored their oaths and acted to clear the Capitol and resume the session. For instance, here are never-before-seen photos and video of congressional leaders in action during the attack. The video is a portion of a call they had at approximately 45 with Acting Secretary of Defense, Chris Miller.
We're not going to let these people keep us from finishing our business, so we need you to get the building cleared, give us the okay so we can go back in session and finish up the people's business as soon as possible.
Mr. Secretary and Senator Schumer, some people here in the Capitol Police believe it would take us several days to secure the building. Do you agree with that analysis?
I'm not on the ground, but I do not agree with that analysis.
So what is the earliest that we could safely resume our proceedings in the Senate and House chambers? The earliest we could safely resume?
Here's my assessment, but I prefer to be on the ground, which I personally would prefer. In 4 to 5 hours.
The vice president also worked the phones from his own secure evacuation
Before
location.
we take a quick break, let's hear what the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Dr. Melina Abdullah, had to say about the role that white supremacy played in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th.
It's really, really important that we as Black people pay attention to what's happening with these January 6th hearings. I know that we can think that this is a white people's issue. Why should we plug in? Let me be very clear. It's imperative that we plug in because what we witnessed on January 6, 2021 was a white supremacist terrorist attack. Undergirding it was white supremacy. In this country, white sheets have been replaced by red caps. White sheets have been replaced by red caps. When we think about Donald Trump and all of those who surround him, people like Steve Bannon and others, this is the new white supremacy, the new white supremacist violence. And we have to be sure that those who engage in white supremacist violence, whether it be an attack on the Capitol or an attack on our folks inside a Tops grocery store in Buffalo, that they are held accountable. So I want to encourage everybody to watch, to pay attention, and to demand that white supremacist terrorists be held accountable.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. Let's get right back inside the chamber.
We had just watched. And so I finished out the workday, went home and called my loved ones to tell them of my decision, and resigned that evening.
Thank you. Indefensible. Let's hear what some of your colleagues in the press office told us about their reaction to this same 417 message.
I felt like it was the absolute bare minimum of what could have been said at that point for something on camera.
What else do you think should have been said?
A more forceful dismissal of the violence, a more forceful command to go home, a more forceful respect for law enforcement, even a comparison to the respect that we have given law enforcement as it relates to what was done to them in the prior summer. And I thought it was important that an acknowledgement be given to the U.S. Capitol building itself, what it's a symbol of, what it means, not only to the people that work there, but to the American people generally, and the work of Congress that by law needed to be conducted that day.
Do you wish, in hindsight, that the president had asked the protesters to leave the Capitol earlier than he ended up asking them to do that?
Of course, I would love if the go home message would have happened earlier in the day.
The president's words matter. We know that many of the rioters were listening to President Trump. We heard from one last week, Stephen Ayers. Let's listen to what he had to say about the 417 message from the president and see how rioters reacted to the president's message in real time.
Well, when we were there, as soon as that come out, everybody started talking about it, and it seemed like it started to disperse, some of the crowd.
I'm here delivering the president's message. Donald Trump has asked everybody to go home.
That's our order. He says go home. He says go home. Yeah, he said to go home.
But just as Mr. Ayers said, police were still fending off the last throes of the brutal assault. I yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
While everyone else was working to get Congress back in session, what did President Trump do? At 6:01, just 1 minute after the citywide curfew went into effect, he posted his last tweet of the day. After officers engaged in multiple hours of hand-to-hand combat, with over 100 of them sustaining injuries, President Trump tweeted at 6:01 and justified the violence as a natural response to the election. He said, quote, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide victory is so unceremoniously, viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly, unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and peace. Remember this day forever." He called the mob great patriots. He told people to remember the day forever. He showed absolutely no remorse. A few minutes later, at 6:27, the president left the dining room and he went up to the White House residence for the night. On the screen is the last photograph of the president that night as he went into the residence. As he was gathering his things in the dining room to leave, President Trump reflected on the day's events with a White House employee. This was the same employee who had met President Trump in the Oval Office after he returned from the ellipse. President Trump said nothing to the employee about the attack. He said only, quote, "Mike Pence let me down." Ms. Matthews, what was your reaction to President Trump's 601 tweet?
At that point, I had already made the decision to resign, and this tweet just further cemented my decision. I thought that January 6, 2021 was one of the darkest days in our nation's history, and President Trump was treating it as a celebratory occasion with that tweet. And so it just further cemented my decision to resign.
Others agreed with your assessment of that tweet. Let's look at what they had to say.
Who asked you about this tweet before it was sent?
The president.
Tell us about that conversation, everything that you said and he said, to the best of your recollection.
Sure. So he said, "What do you think of this?" And I believe I saw the text message or on his phone. And I remember saying to him, the wording on the first sentence, I guess it's one long sentence, but the wording on the first sentence would lead some to believe that potentially he had something to do with the events that happened at the Capitol.
What did he say?
I don't recall him saying anything in response to that. I believe that was the end of the conversation.
Did he change anything in light of your comments?
No, sir, he did not.
And what about this made you think that someone might perceive the president having a role in the violence at the Capitol?
It was my interpretation of the words. I mean, I'm not I don't write speeches or anything, but the phrase, "these are the things that happened," to me sounded as if culpability was associated with it, to me.
I don't think it's a patriotic act to attack the Capitol, but I have no idea how to characterize the people other than they trespassed, destroyed, assaulted the U.S. Capitol. I think calling, let's say, a stretch, to say the least.
Is that all it is, a stretch, or just flatly wrong?
I don't think it's a patriotic act to attack the U.S. Capitol.
Would you call it unpatriotic?
Criminal? Unpatriotic, sure.
What happened at the Capitol cannot be justified in any form or fashion. It was wrong and it was tragic, and it was a terrible day. It was a terrible day for this country.
I thought it was inappropriate.
Why?
To my mind, it was a day that should be remembered in infamy. That wasn't the tenor of this tweet.
Despite the violence of the day, the effort to delay the certification continued. That evening, Rudy Giuliani called several of President Trump's closest political allies in the hour before the joint session resumed. Representative Jim Jordan and Senators Marsha Blackburn, Tommy Tuberville, Bill Hagerty, Lindsey Graham, Josh. We know why Mr. Giuliani was calling them, because at 7:02, he left a voicemail for Senator Tuberville, which later became public. Let's listen to just the start of it.
Senator Tuberville, or I should say Coach Tuberville, this is Rudy Giuliani, President's lawyer. I'm calling you because I want to discuss with you how they rushed this hearing. Friends, slow it down so we can get these legislatures to get more information to you.
Mr. Giuliani did not even mention the attack on the Capitol. Instead, he was pushing on behalf of President Trump to get members of Congress to further delay the certification. Congress stood firm and successfully concluded the joint session in the early morning hours of January 7th.
That President Trump is practically and morally
This concludes the committee hearing.
I mean, this is some riveting some testimony here. Can't
Yes,
not all that surprised. I mean, it's so interesting to me, hearing Sarah Matthews, talk about how she had enough on the day of the insurrection and the inadequate response of the president. That 601 tweet really sort of reaffirming her decision to resign the day of the insurrection. But one of the things that comes to mind is like Dr. Maya Angelou used to say, when people show you who they really are, believe them the first time, right? And so, this wasn't the first time that you've seen, former President Trump deliver mixed messages, sort of, flirting with, white supremacists or white supremacist violence. And so, I don't know what some of our viewers are thinking, but, on one hand, it's nice to see folks like Sarah Matthews sort of stepping up, and to Jehmu's point earlier, putting country before party. But, I can't help but wonder, well, where had they been for, the 4 years and the year and a half he was campaigning for president?
That's a great question, Dr. Quartey. I mean, look, I think here's the truth. I think if you talk to the average Trump supporter, or even if you talk to Sarah Matthews or Cassidy Hutchinson, they would tell you that they agreed with all of Trump's policies, period. They had a problem when Donald Trump went too far with the big lie. They believe that after after November 8th, when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were sort of basically announced as the president and vice president-elect, it was over. And literally, even if you go back to the analogs of history, even Mitch McConnell gave Trump and Rudy Giuliani enough room. He was like, okay, well, we'll let you guys go through your legal cases. Go ahead, sue away, see what happens. Then we get to Thanksgiving, and these legal cases are all flopping. I mean, they're flipping and flopping. It's a mess. There's not one case that they won, not one. All the evidence they had was trash. There was not a federal judge, not one appointed by Barack Obama, not one appointed by George Bush, not one appointed by Bill Clinton, not one appointed by Donald Trump himself that would give Trump's legal team a victory here. And at that point in time, as they got to mid-December, Mitch McConnell came out and said, Donald Trump, it's over. And yet still, these people continue to believe the big lie. And they believed the big lie all the way until January 6th, when the big lie got so big that folks used that big lie to perpetrate an invasion of the United States Capitol on the one day that it mattered. You've heard me say this before, soulmates. There's not very many federal laws around the governing of a presidential election, but the one law that does exist, it says very simply, on January 6th at noon.
January 20th.
January 6th at noon.
January 6th.
A joint session of Congress presided by the vice president must certify the electoral votes from all the states. And so they knew this going in, and they decided to invade the Capitol on the one day that you were supposed to see a peaceful transfer of power in order to perpetuate the big lie. A big lie that everybody knew wasn't true, a big lie that that could not stand the daylight of a courtroom, a big lie that couldn't stand the daylight of a legislature, and yet still they continued to push it. And it caused the death of a number of Capitol Hill police officers. And now here we are, almost a year later, and we're still talking about it because of the impact that it had on the entirety of the country and on the democracy.
Now we're going to go back to the January 6th committee hearing in progress.
I think we're having some technical difficulties, so let's continue this conversation. Richard, to your point about a year out and people believing the big lie, I think it's really important to note that the believers in the big lie have actually increased since January 6th. There are more people who believe the big lie today than did on January 6th. So that is something, I'm thinking we just heard from the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, talking about why we as a community need to be paying attention to these hearings. If you look at the Republican primary winners to date, over half of the people who have won the Republican nomination across the country, over half of them are believers in the big lie. And over half of them are determined to, if they win the position they are going for, to make changes to election law that will make it harder for people who don't agree with them to have their votes counted. So in many ways, the big lie is winning. The big lie has been working. And that's why these hearings, really going through this evidence, going through the timeline, filling in the gaps is so important, because regardless of what we know as being reality and being the truth, there are millions of people out there who have been sucked into this big lie messaging, and it's only gotten worse since January 6th of 2021.
I think that's right, Jehmu, and I will add in what Bradley Tucker in the chat just said. It's just a bunch of MAGA yes men trying to save themselves. And look, I think they're trying to save themselves to the point where it's showing up in the midterm elections. And as we said at the beginning of the show, with Joe Biden's approval rating being so low, you would almost it would be a foregone conclusion that the Democrats will lose control of both the House and the Senate, and likely a number of governors' mansions. The biggest aid in helping Democrats in this moment is Republicans and the big lie. Just take a look at what happened this past Tuesday in Maryland. In Maryland, where a blue state with a Republican governor, the young woman that the governor Larry Hogan nominated lost to somebody who believes in, you guessed it, the big lie. And now Democrats will have a chance to recapture this governor's mansion because of that. Same goes for Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, the Senate candidate there, somebody who believes in the big lie, Mohamed Oz, and he will be against somebody who doesn't. So what you're seeing is the big lie has now taken on legs, and it's taken on a movement, and people are running on it, and they're winning primary elections. Now it's going to be on the folks who watch this show and the folks in community all across the country to vote those folks out.
And speaking of elections, to your point, Richard, we know that Black folks in Pennsylvania, Black folks in Wisconsin, Black folks in Georgia, Black folks in North Carolina, all have a chance to really push back against the big lie and really pull the United States Senate, towards the agenda that we voted for, that a lot of folks voted for in 2020 in support of Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the Democrats. And so, on one hand, they're laying out the facts, and we're learning more and more about what happened on that infamous day. But each one of these insights has the opportunity to power our momentum, to power the movement towards the ballot box. That was essentially what Cliff from Black Voters Matter was sharing earlier today, and they and so many other groups are on the ground doing some incredible organizing work. We heard Melanie Campbell from Black Women's Roundtable earlier in this broadcast make very clear that we have to vote like not just our lives, but our democracy depends on it. And we're learning from this hearing exactly how fragile things have been and how fragile things were on January 6th.
And Dr. Quartey, you listed off some states where Black voters are going to be paying attention and hopefully speaking truth to power with their vote. I think one of the things we have to also keep in mind is there are almost 600,000 elected offices across the U.S. And something like 95% of the financial resources, 95% of the media attention, 95% of what we talk about when we talk about politics in settings like this is focused on the federal offices, is focused on Congress and the White House. What we tend to forget is those state houses, those state elections, that when you look at what the Supreme Court is doing and really trying to move decisions back to the states, it is more important than ever before that we give some attention and give resources and understand the importance of who is running for your state rep position. In a state like Maryland, it's a delegate. Who is running, for those local offices that are going to have the power to be making the decisions now that the Supreme Court is rolling back all of these rights. And so I just want to keep in mind as we talk about elections to not just keep our focus on what is happening with the White House 2024 or with Congress and who's going to win the Senate or keep the Senate or the House, but keep it state specific too, because the power is moving back to the states with what the Supreme Court has been up to of late.
Absolutely right, and well said. We're going to take a break and coming right back with Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. We'll be right back. Welcome to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. We have been monitoring the chat, and we really appreciate how interactive this experience has been. And I know, Richard, you had your eye on the chat box. What are the people saying? What are our soulmates? What are they saying?
Listen, I've been keeping tabs of the soulmates for this the entirety of this hearing. Some interesting comments. One, stand up to Trump. Somebody types in, God knows everything. I agree with that particular person. Somebody said, thank y'all for hosting this live chat and this broadcast. We want to thank y'all at home for watching this broadcast as well, because we would not be here without you and without you guys being part of our soulmate conversation. And this has been a riveting evening with some riveting testimony for sure. Not only have we seen, and I think that was the most interesting part for me, Jehmu, was watching the president trying to get the messaging right, which should have been easy, but he didn't want to upset the people who he told to invade the Capitol.
Absolutely. I mean, it was the definition of a hostage video. He was being held hostage by the actual patriots on his team who wanted him to put country first. He was being held hostage even by his members, his family members who were pushing him. We've seen all of the tweets and the texts that came from members of Congress, the texts that came from, Fox colleagues, Hannity, Laura Ingraham, people pleading and pleading. And in front of that camera, we all got to see in tonight's hearing that hostage video where he did not want to tell his supporters to be peaceful, to leave the Capitol. He did not want to do that. And that's why it took so many takes.
And yeah, I mean, I think that's it. And even if you listen to I wrote down some of the quotes he said. He says, you have to respect the people in law and order. Even though this was a fraudulent election, we have to have peace. It's almost as if he was saying, like, dog sit, dog run. Like, it was this messaging was so bizarre that if you were one of his supporters, you wouldn't know what to do. So do you want me to continue invading the Capitol? Do you want me to go home? What do you want me to do, Mr. President? And what we also found out in watching some of this testimony we saw from the impeachment back in January of 2020, was the supporters of Trump, the invaders of the Capitol, were waiting for his message. And you literally saw them huddled around the phone and says, we've gotten a message from President Trump. He says it's time for us to go home. And then you see them leaving. And it's just a very interesting moment to watch the president do this. And I think the other thing that was very interesting to me is because this is a president who prided himself on being somebody who liked the generals. And what you watch happen throughout the entirety of this hearing is he wasn't communicating with the generals on this particular day. Nancy Pelosi was communicating with the generals. Chuck Schumer was talking to the generals. Vice President Mike Pence was talking to the generals. Donald Trump was in his dining room watching the Capitol being invaded, And like you said, Dr. Quartey, before, just in the last hour, for multiple hours, for 187 minutes, almost 3 hours, he did nothing to protect the United States Capitol as it was under siege.
I mean, the president just sat there. The president just sat there and he sulked. He sat there in the dining room sulking. One of the lines that really jumped out at me from what the president said in his former president in his video remarks, we had an election stolen from us, but you have to go home. We need law and order. And you're right, Richard. What a mixed message, right? I mean, anybody delivering that message, you are encouraging or enabling the people that, feel that they are rightly there because something was stolen from them. There's nothing stolen from them. There's nothing stolen from them. And everybody that testified today affirmed that. The folks in the White House, they knew nothing was stolen. Yet and still, this president, was insistent on weaponizing the power of the presidency, against members of Congress and against his oath of office. And it's going to be interesting to see how Republicans, try to create some contrast between their position today and what their position was, the day of the insurrection, where you saw, a seemingly terrified Leader McCarthy, a shaken Senator McConnell, and so it's going to be interesting to see, how they explain that to their supporters and how they explain that to the American people.
But I think they already have, though, Dr. Quartey. They've done this already. Their answer is it happened, but don't worry about that. Let's talk about inflation. Let's talk about gas prices. Let's talk about Joe Biden's age. Let's talk about everything but what happened on January 6th and former President Donald Trump. So I definitely think what you've seen from Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, Mitch McConnell, on down, is you've already seen their response. They're going to talk about everything else but what happened on January 6th. They would rather have a debate about the ideal that we're, quote unquote, teaching critical race theory to our children, or why we need to ban gay in Florida schools, than they would about January 6th. And here's the truth. What we know from primary elections in Maryland, in Pennsylvania, in Florida, in Texas, in Arizona, is that this messaging is working for their base. The idea that we could act like it never happened and talk about the smoke over there where there is no fire is working for them.
So the question is, at what point will this not work for them? Jehmu?
Well, I actually wanted to just take it back to, I know y'all were talking about where McConnell was and where McCarthy was. From tonight's hearing, we can't forget, run for cover, Senator Josh Hawley. And that image, those sets of images that were so perfectly highlighted, I think are going to be just kind of looking at what is going on Twitter right now. There's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of humor. There's a lot of anger around those images of Josh Hawley running for cover. And then also, Richard, to your point about former President Trump and the generals, we can't forget that when Black Lives Matter protests were going on outside of the White House, not within the White House, not having penetrated the grounds of the White House, but outside of the White House, President Trump did turn to generals and say, can't you just shoot them? Shoot them in the leg. He was having a conversation about taking violent action.
But he did take violent action, Jehmu. He did. He tear gassed them for a photo op.
Yes. But I mean, he had every capacity to have that same sort of anger, same sort of focus, same sort of need to get something done on January 6th. And of course, he was not going to do that with the base that he had. And I think this has been a part of these hearings from the very beginning, and what they've done a really good job on is showing that this was a conspiracy. This was something that didn't happen just out of the blue on January 6th. Donald Trump was involved in the planning of it. He wanted his supporters to be armed as they walked to and entered the Capitol. And so, of course, in supporting this conspiracy that he was a part of from the beginning, he would never have actually told the generals to take action in the same way he did against the Black Lives Matter protesters outside of the White House.
And Black folks have been saying this for a month of Sundays. We have been saying this for a long time, that Donald Trump doesn't come at Black folks the way that comes at Black folks differently than the way that he comes at white folks, and dare I say, white supremacists and their enablers. We saw this when he was running for office, and, when he ran on a message of making America great again, we already knew that dog whistle, and then when the event in Charlottesville happened, Black folks weren't crazy, when he said, there are fine people on both sides, this is a president that has played loose with the facts, for a long time, and has been supported by a movement of enablers inside and outside of elected office. And these hearings are really zeroing in on exactly who these enablers are and how they have, and in some cases continue to enable the former president to fan the flames of hate and to peddle in the politics of grievance.
I think that's right. I think it's all of that, right? And I think this is the foregone conclusion that you walk away from January 6th knowing. You walk away understanding that Donald Trump really could care less about the democracy when it came to him winning and him being the president of the United States. And he would have did anything in his power to make sure he was the president. That is why, as we speak, in the state of Georgia, the district attorney in Fulton County is pursuing a case against Donald Trump. And she announced just this week that all 16 individuals who were part of the fake electors are now interested in her investigation. Why? Because they knew that Donald Trump didn't win the election in Georgia. And I think in that call that he had with the Secretary of State of Georgia, Joe Raffensperger, was probably the best piece of evidence that we have this. He called this man on the phone and said, we need you to go find 11,301 votes. So we need you to go find one more vote than what I need so that I could maintain my place as the president of the United States. That's the definition of electoral fraud. It's the definition of it.
And I can't help but think about the images we've seen earlier this week of Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman AOC, and other members of the squad being arrested, being handcuffed in front of the Supreme Court as they were protesting the gutting of Roe. And when we think back to January 6th, and we've seen these images now over and over, and hearing the audio tonight of what the rioters were saying, that not one person was arrested on January 6th. With the damage they caused, with their intent, with their weaponry that they took onto the Capitol grounds, not one person was arrested.
Yeah, and that's why we are in search of accountability. Who knows if we'll get it, but we are still looking at a whole lot of evidence that suggests that we should, and quick, fast, and in a hurry. We are going to take a break and coming right back with Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing.
Welcome back to Fox Soul coverage of this January 6th special committee investigating the invasion of the Capitol. I want to thank you all for joining us. And now don't go anywhere. I want you to stay right there, because after this break, we begin our post show. And trust me, you don't want to miss it. So we'll see you right after this break for our hot takes, our analysis, and some of your comments from the chat. See you soon. Welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings
post-show. I'm Dr. Nii Quartelai Quartey, joined by Richard Fowler and Jehmu Greene. You've been watching some pretty riveting testimony this evening. The January 6th committee really laying out what happened the day of the insurrection for that time period between when the president was whipping up his followers at the January 6th rally to the end of the insurrection later that evening. 187 minutes. I think that's the magic number that we're all going to be talking about as we go into the weekend and beyond, is for 187 minutes, the president of the United States, the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief, was missing in action. Jehmu, were you surprised?
Not in the least bit. I mean, I think that we all can remember very vividly what we were doing, what we felt on that day and the days immediately following it. But certainly, I don't recall any sort of feeling of surprise around Donald Trump. I think you said it best earlier in our conversation. Donald Trump had already shown the American people, shown the world who he was. And that's why he was soundly defeated in November of 2020. None of this has necessarily been a surprise. I have been very impressed with the work of the committee, how much they are doing their due diligence, how much time they are willing to continue getting to the truth of the matter. I think in looking back at tonight's hearing, it's really important to lift up Representative Elaine Luria, who, even as we missed the leader of the Homeland Security Committee and the chair of these hearings, Benny Thompson, while he's been out getting healthy after his COVID diagnosis, that we saw someone like Elaine Luria, who was in a very, very close race in Virginia, step up. She is a former Navy commander, was in the Navy for 20 years. And I think her taking us through the details of those 187 minutes tonight was extremely powerful. And I look forward to what comes next with this committee. I think it is having an impact. And I think the more that the organizations like Black Lives Matter, Black Voters Matter, Melanie Campbell's National Coalition on Black Civic Participation can connect those dots, the more that you will see Black voters really understanding the direct line between what we saw on January 6th with gallows, with racial slurs being shouted out at police officers, with the nooses, with all of that very symbolic racism in the Capitol, Confederate flag being walked through the Capitol, that this hearing, that the big lie, that the impact of what started months before January 6th has real world implications for our voting rights, for the issues we care about, for our communities and for our family. There's a direct line to it. And I look forward to the committee doing even more to draw those direct lines.
Richard, during the hearing, you really laid out very beautifully how the president moves around from place to place. And you did a beautiful job, describing just sort of all that goes into making sure that the president, as the president moves from location to location, that their safety is put above anything else. And you noted the fact that it took the Secret Service 45 minutes. This was according to Sergeant Robinson's testimony when Representative Schiff was interviewing him. It took the Secret Service 45 minutes to make the final decision as to whether or not they were going to be able to take the president to the Capitol as he had requested. Can you share with our soulmates again Why is that bit of information so significant?
Listen, I'll be honest with you. I think that's some of the most critical information that we found out in this particular hearing, right? Is because, like I said at the top of the show, when the president moves around the Washington, D.C., there is a bubble sort of constructed around him everywhere. So if, for example, if the president is moving under a bridge, they shut down above the bridge to walking traffic, to foot traffic, to bike traffic, to car traffic. If the president's moving on a highway, oftentimes the entirety of the highway is shut down so the president can move singularly by himself with his motorcade. This motorcade has multiple vehicles in it. It's usually a 20 to 30 car motorcade that includes an ambulance, that includes remote communications facilities. Also, if something happens, the president can be in control of the country no matter where he is. The White House literally moves with the not the physical building, but all the necessary things in that building moves with the president, whether he's walking outside, whether he's walking the dog, or whether he's taking a trip overseas. And so the fact that you have a couple of things that happened that Sergeant Robinson for the Metropolitan Police Department lay out in his testimony that I think are rather damning. He says first, on the special events sort of radio channel, there was notifications of folks in trees with armed weapons. Now, this is a red flag if the presidential motorcade is moving, like I just said. When the president's moving, there is nobody else moving. There's no foot traffic. And if there is foot traffic, there's usually an armed officer standing in front of that foot traffic. So that's the first red flag. So there were people with guns in trees, number one. And here's the truth. We found out from Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony, the president of the United States knew about these people within trees with weapons. He wanted those people to be closer to him because he thought they would do him no harm. And better yet, he thought they were going to harm the members of Congress and harm the vice president. He was okay with that because the ultimate goal was for him to stay in the White House. The next thing we find out in this testimony is that they idled, like you said, Dr. Quartey, they idled for 45 minutes to an hour waiting for somebody to make a decision. This is uncharacteristic of movements of the president for a number of reasons. Number one, movements of the president, usually they notify the press immediately. So for 45 minutes, everybody was in limbo because Donald Trump wanted to go to the Capitol. Now, what we found out from Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony is that he tried to sort of jump and take the steering wheel. Now, there's been some discrepancy of whether or not that testimony is true, but whether or not that testimony is true, it doesn't negate the fact that Donald Trump knew a violent, angry mob was heading to the Capitol. He knew they had weapons and he wanted to join them. And what makes this more damning, as I said last hour, and I'll repeat it again, he wanted to join them at the time, the only time in American history, in federal law, where there's actually a law on the books that governs what Congress must do in the transfer of power from one presidency to another, which is on January 6th at noon. They must transfer, the joint session of Congress, chaired by the vice president, must certify the Electoral College votes. And so for anybody out there watching, anytime you hear Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy or any Republican compare January 6th to the uprising that happened after George Floyd, here is the unique difference between those two events. Nobody wants to see burning in their street. Nobody wants to see violence. Well, it's one thing to have somebody tear down a CVS or tear down a Target. It's another thing to have an angry, violent mob strategically invade the Capitol at the time when they are counting the Electoral College votes. There's a big difference there. So do not let them make that comparison because it's not based in reality.
While we've been on the air, USA Today reported that the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General has launched a criminal investigation into the destruction of Secret Service text messages sought as a part of the investigation into the January 6th Capitol attack. A letter notifying the Secret Service of the probe was directed by Director James Murray on Wednesday night. And the existence of criminal investigation was first disclosed by NBC. Jehmu, has the price for those text messages, has the power of those text messages increased after having watched this hearing and after having learned of that 45-minute period, where the president wanted to go and Secret Service was seemingly trying to make it happen or not happen. How much more important are those text messages now compared to 3 hours ago?
I think they are so critical. I think there are a lot of people who are sitting on the edge of their seat. And, at the start of the hearing, we heard very clearly from Congresswoman Cheney that they would be doing a very deep dive, doing a lot of due diligence, continuing these hearings into September. And so I can expect that they're going to get to the bottom of it. It's kind of like, when you're watching a movie that is some kind of thriller and you figure out the ending, very early on. You definitely figure it out before the creators want you to. And I don't know about the two of y'all, but when you first heard that these text messages disappeared, and the excuse was, this was some kind of routine upgrading of devices. I mean, that did not pass any sort of smell test at all. I don't know if there's anyone out there, regardless of even what side you're on, who thought that was accurate. And so I am very much looking forward to the committee getting to the bottom of this. Glad that there has been a shift, that there's a criminal investigation in this, and I think that's probably where, if there's more drama to come in these hearings, I think that's one of the areas where we will see a lot of that drama, a lot of some more bombs dropping. One of the things I wanted to hear a little bit more of, maybe we'll hear it in a future hearing, is on Mark Meadows, the chief of staff at the time. We've gotten such clear information from Cassidy Hutchinson on his movements, on his response. But following her testimony, we had a former chief of staff, acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, to President Trump, say that Mark Meadows was either incompetent or that he had a breakdown on January 6th. And so I've been expecting to hear more about the decisions he was making, because, quite frankly, there's an odd connection to these 187 minutes, the 45 minutes of no movement, no communication around what the president was going to do, and what we are seeing with the Uvalde shooting, and who was in charge, who was making the decisions. The National Guard wasn't getting any direction from the White House. They were talking to Senator Schumer, talking to Speaker Pelosi, talking to the vice president. There's some really strange parallels with these 187 minutes, the 45 minutes, with the kind of command situation on the ground that we saw break down in Uvalde. And, from a drip standpoint, there are lots of different drops coming from these hearings, and I think really, in a sense, adding up, filling up the bucket, becoming more of a wave, what might be a tsunami that makes some really impact in November. I think all of this is accumulating into real impact. I know gas prices are high. I know inflation is high. I know approval numbers for President Biden are low, but I do think this accumulation is having an impact. And the last thing I will say is what I'm looking forward to also, which I don't know if y'all agree with me, but I've been very surprised. Where is the information about the pipe bomb that was outside of the Democratic National Committee headquarters when our Vice President, Kamala Harris, was inside that building? The idea that we have not found the perpetrators who put that active bomb outside of that building, that there's no more information, where the Secret Service is on that is really, really disturbing. And I do hope that we get some answers looking forward to more hearings.
And that's a really important point that you bring up, Jehmu. The getting more information about what happened and who was tracking that in real time and who's been held accountable for those pipe bombs planted outside DNC headquarters that could have put at that point our vice president elect put her life at risk. But you also underscore the importance of Black media. Being here on Fox Soul at the moment, that I'm on KBLA every week, and none of us are strangers to Black media. What do you think about the idea that these hearings have actually made Black press more important than ever? You mentioned the tsunami that is coming in November. Hopefully it's a tsunami of Black folks and folks intent on defeating white supremacy heading to the polls. But that doesn't happen. People don't get the information that they need in order to show up, without, messages and messengers and people that are in community with them, sort of providing those insights. Richard, share a little bit about just the importance of Black press, particularly in this moment in time, as we're going through these January 6 hearings.
Well, listen, I think Black press is more important now than ever. Who else is going to tell our story but us? And so whether it's Black independent-owned media or it's Black journalists working in larger media organizations, illuminating Black stories, uplifting the issues facing Black America, uplifting the intersection of those issues with what's facing America in general is needed now more than ever. It's one of the reasons why I continue to do my work as a storyteller at both Forbes as well as a contributor at the Fox News Channel. Because why? We have to be in every space, everywhere, telling our story and telling it as loud as possible. And it matters now more than ever, because if we're not telling our story, we're going to leave it up to others to tell our story. And if we do that, like as they say, that means we're no longer at the table, we're on the menu, which is why we should continue to support Black media. We must continue to push for Black media, whether it is influencers on Instagram, or it's folks who are writing stories, or folks who are on the radio every week, or folks who are owners and journalists at Black owned and operated newspaper outlets. It's so important that we are everywhere telling our story and telling how we're impacted by the stories that happen every day. We know that there were Black police officers in the Capitol. There were Black lawmakers in the Capitol. A fifth of the Democratic caucus is made up of African-American lawmakers. So their voices matter, and who better to tell their stories than members of the Black media?
And I know right here in Los Angeles, there is a very distinct voice that has been amplifying the voices of Black folks for a long time. We know him as Danny Bakewell Sr. He is the publisher of the Los Angeles Sentinel and the LA Watts Times. And we have a very special message from this incredible community activist, this incredible leader, not just here in Los Angeles, but he is a leader among leaders, among Black newspaper publishers across the country. Take a look at what Danny Bakewell Sr. Had to say, what good word he left us with before we bring our coverage to a close.
Hi, I'm Danny Bakewell Sr., civil rights activist, executive publisher, and chairman of the Los Angeles Sentinel and the LA Watts Times. I'm talking to you because I think it's important that we use these hearings and recognize these hearings as our call to action. The time when all of our freedoms are being taken away from us, and Republicans and racists are trying to roll back all of the successes that our parents, grandparents, and those who have come before us have fought and died for in many instances. We've got to recognize that it's our time to get out to vote. Our brother Ben Chavis, who is our president now, is putting together a nationwide call to action and a bus trip to communities around the country making sure that we go in our communities and ask our people to make sure we register to vote and get out to vote. Registering to vote is not enough. We've got to actually be at the polls this year with no reservations and no hesitation. And we do that by showing up, showing out, and demonstrating that these are important times to us, and we will not sit by idly and watch our future disintegrate right before our eyes at the hands of people who have not only do not have the best interests of Black people at heart, but do not have the best interests of America at heart. The two in this case go hand in hand, and we've got to make sure that we show up to take care of business. Vote, vote, vote. That is the rallying call. And you need to pay attention to these hearings, because Donald Trump is at the very, very baseline of everything that is trying to erode our freedoms in America.
On behalf of Richard Fowler, Jehmu Greene, I'm Dr. Nii Quartelai Quartey. Thank you for joining us. Good night.